Vanessa Rourke grabbed the brooch from her jacket pocket, pressed it into her assistant's palm, and smiled like she was handing over a gift. Put it in the apron, the one with the broken strap. Make it look like she shoved it in fast. Her assistant hesitated. Vanessa, if this goes wrong, it won't. Vanessa was already smoothing her blazer. She's a cleaner. Nobody questions a cleaner stealing. That's the whole point. That single moment, 30 seconds, no witnesses, a ballroom full of Chicago's wealthiest people 2 floors above, would unravel everything Vanessa had spent 11 years building. But not before it nearly destroyed Imani Brooks completely. If you were standing in that marble hallway wearing a borrowed uniform, knowing you'd done nothing wrong while 300 people stared at you like you were already guilty, what would you do? Would you beg? Would you break? Or would you look straight at the most feared man in Chicago and tell him that his word alone wasn't enough? Stay with me through this story, because what happens next inside that ballroom is something I still think about. And I think you will too. If this kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The service entrance on the east side of the Harrington Grand smelled like industrial cleaner and cold air, and Imani Brooks had learned over the years that there were 2 kinds of people who came through it. People who knew exactly what they were walking into, and people who still had hope left. She was mostly the first kind now. She had her work shoes in a plastic bag because the soles were starting to separate on the left one, and she didn't want the rubber to catch on anything before she'd even clocked in. That was the kind of thing that happened when you were 32 years old and rebuilding from scratch. You protected the shoes. You planned around the shoes. The shoes were a bigger decision than most people's car purchases. The guard at the check-in table barely looked at her. He slid a clipboard across without making eye contact. You're on floor prep and maintenance, ballroom and adjoining halls. Event starts at 7. You're done by 11 or whenever Director Rourke dismisses you, whichever comes later. My authorization form says 11 is the cutoff, whichever comes later. He finally looked up. The expression on his face made it clear this wasn't a conversation. Imani signed the form. She took her apron from the hook on the wall, the one with her temporary worker number stamped on the front pocket. She noticed immediately that the strap had been repaired with a safety pin instead of properly sewn, and the pin was already half open. She pressed it shut with her thumb and told herself it would hold. It was going to be a long night. She met the other temp workers in a room barely big enough for all of them. 6 people, 4 different staffing agencies, nobody who knew each other. The kind of group that forms when a company needs warm bodies and cheap ones. There was a young man named Jerome who kept checking his phone because his wife had just had a baby 2 weeks ago and he needed the overtime. There was a woman named Cecilia who was maybe 60 and moved like her knees hurt, but moved anyway, because 60-year-old women with bad knees still needed to eat. There was a kid who couldn't have been more than 20 who gave his name as Darius and looked like this was possibly his first professional job of any kind. Imani had been all of them at different points in her life. She found a corner and began checking her supplies. Mop, bucket, 2 kinds of solution, one for the marble floors that required the pH balance stuff, not the cheap version, and a pair of gloves that had a small tear in the right index finger. She turned the glove inside out, pressed the torn seam flat, and put it back on. It would hold for a few hours if she was careful. She was always careful. The briefing from their assigned supervisor lasted 4 minutes. He was a heavy-set man named Gary, who spoke entirely in the passive voice, as though the rules existed without anyone having made them. Workers were expected to remain in designated zones. Phones were to be stored in the provided lockers. He gestured at a row of small metal boxes during the event hours. Meals would be provided in 2 shifts. He didn't say when or what the meals were. Phones in the lockers, Imani said. Not a question exactly. A test. Gary blinked. That's what I said. Our employment agreements with the staffing agencies say we retain personal property during non-event facing work periods. If we're in the service areas, Director Rourke's policy supersedes staffing agreements on site. Imani looked at him. She wanted to say 4 things. She said none of them. She put her phone in the locker and kept the number, 14, in her memory, the way she kept everything, like it mattered, because sometimes it did. The Harrington Grand's ballroom was, genuinely, one of the most beautiful rooms in Chicago. Imani knew this not because she was impressed by beautiful rooms, but because she had cleaned enough of them to develop an opinion. The marble was real. She could tell by the temperature variation underfoot, the way it held cold at the seams. The chandeliers were crystal, not glass. The flower arrangements alone probably cost more than her monthly rent, which was not a particularly high bar, given that her monthly rent was already higher than anything she'd budgeted for 2 years ago when she took the apartment because it was the only one that approved her application without a cosigner. She worked methodically. She always did. There was something almost meditative about a big empty room before an event, the way it existed in potential, all dressed up for something that hadn't happened yet. She mopped in the pattern that minimized streaking on marble, overlapping figure eights, not straight lines, because straight lines left seams you could see from across the room when the lights hit. That was when she heard the sound. Not a loud sound, not an alarm. Something much quieter and much more dangerous. The soft, persistent tick of water hitting a surface it wasn't supposed to hit. She followed it behind the secondary staging area near the east wall, where a portable bar had been assembled alongside the ballroom's electrical distribution panel. The panel wasn't sparking, it wasn't visibly wet, but the drip was coming from a pipe fitting in the ceiling above it, and the moisture was moving along a seam in the wall toward the junction box at the base of the panel. Imani stood there for a moment and did the math. Event starting in 40 minutes. Ballroom filling with 300 people. Open bar. Electricity. Water. Moving. She went to find someone in authority. The first technician she found, a man with a radio on his belt who was arguing with someone over earpiece, told her to report it to Gary. Gary told her it was outside the cleaning team's scope and to go back to her zone. The second technician, the one actually responsible for the electrical setup, listened to her for 45 seconds before Vanessa Rourke appeared at the end of the corridor like a weather system that had developed a personality. Vanessa was tall. She had the kind of posture that came from a long career of being the person everyone looked to in a crisis, and the kind of expression that came from viewing most crises as inconveniences to her schedule. She was maybe 45, wearing a headset, carrying a tablet that she was typing on while walking, which Imani had always thought was the professional equivalent of talking with your mouth full. "What's the problem?" Vanessa said. It wasn't quite a question. "There's water tracking toward your east panel distribution junction," Imani said. She kept her voice level and factual. This was something she had learned. When you want someone in authority to take you seriously, you use their language, not your feelings. The drip is slow, but it's been going for a while based on the moisture pattern on the wall. At current rate, it'll reach the base connection within the next 20 minutes before your event begins. Vanessa looked at her. Not at the wall. At her. "You're one of the temp cleaners." "Yes, but what I'm describing is, I know what you're describing." Vanessa looked at the technician instead. "Is she correct?" The technician, to his credit, hesitated only briefly before nodding. "She might be. I'd want to check." "Then check it quietly and handle it. We are 40 minutes from guest arrival." She looked back at Imani with an expression that managed to be both dismissive and somehow grateful in a way that cost nothing. "Thank you. Go back to your zone." Imani went back to her zone. She picked up her mop and she thought about the fact that Vanessa had not actually told anyone to fix the pipe. She had told someone to check it quietly. Those were different things. She thought about the 280 guests who would be standing near an open bar next to an electrical panel with water moving toward it. She thought about Jerome and Cecilia and Darius, who would be serving those guests. She took out the small notebook she always kept in her back pocket, not her phone, because her phone was in locker 14, but the notebook, which nobody had thought to confiscate because nobody thought a cleaner with a notebook was a threat. And she wrote down the time, the location, the names of the people she had spoken to, and what she had observed. She did not know yet why she was writing it down. She just knew that she was. The event had been running for 40 minutes when the electrical system tripped. Not a full outage, a partial failure. The lighting rigs on the east side of the ballroom dimmed and 3 of the bar stations lost power to their refrigerated units. Inconvenient. Embarrassing. Not dangerous, because the technician had apparently found the water and rerouted the connection before it got far enough to matter. But Vanessa's face, when Imani saw it from across the room, was the face of someone filing a grievance that she intended to collect on later. The problem was that she was looking at Imani when she made that face. And Imani, who had spent her entire adult life learning to read rooms the way some people read weather, not by what was being said, but by what was being communicated underneath the saying, felt the shift in the air like a drop in temperature. She had seen it before. The moment when someone in authority decides that the person who identified the problem is actually the problem. She kept mopping. It was during her second pass through the service corridor that she found the paperwork. She wasn't looking for it. She was looking for a replacement mop head because the one she had was starting to shed fiber and would leave lint on the marble, which was worse in some ways than a dirty floor because it was visible under the event lighting, and it would be her name on the work order, not the supply closet's name for stocking inferior equipment. The service corridor supply room was unlocked. Inside, on the folding table that served as a workspace for the event coordination staff, was a stack of documents that shouldn't have been left out, but apparently had been, because whoever had been using them last had been called away in a hurry. A radio sat beside the stack, still crackling softly. Imani's eyes moved across the papers without meaning to. Payroll authorization sheets, worker counts, meal and overtime provisions for the evening. What she saw made her stop. The sheets listed 47 workers for tonight's event. There were 14 people in the service entrance sign-in log she had seen when she arrived. She stood very still. She was not an accountant. She was not an investigator. She was a woman with a torn glove and a repaired shoe sole who needed this paycheck badly enough to work a 12-hour shift for a company she'd never worked for before. But she had also spent 3 years doing accounts receivable for a logistics company before everything fell apart. And she knew what inflated labor numbers looked like on paper. She knew what the gap between reported workers and actual workers meant in terms of where that difference in wages was going. She did not touch the papers. She did not move them. She took out her notebook and wrote down what she'd seen. The document header, the numbers, the date stamp in the corner, and put the notebook back in her pocket. She took a replacement mop head from the shelf and went back to work. She was crossing the edge of the ballroom, near the private alcove that separated the main hall from the family reception area, when she saw him. She almost didn't recognize him. 12 years changed a person in ways that photographs never quite captured. The boy she had found in that warehouse had been 22, bleeding from a head wound, pinned under fallen ceiling material, surrounded by men who were panicking in the specific way that people panic when they have guns and no idea what to do with them. He had been shaking. He had been trying not to show it. This man was not shaking. This man sat at the head table in a black suit that probably cost more than her car, with the kind of stillness that comes from absolute certainty about where you are in any given room. He was talking to the man on his right without looking at him, which meant he was also watching the entire ballroom simultaneously. His hands rested on the table, and she could see the tattooing at his wrists. Dante Moretti. She knew the name. Everybody in certain parts of Chicago knew the name. Not the details. The details were the kind of thing that existed in news articles that were carefully written around certain facts. But the presence. The way certain things in the city happened or didn't happen, moved or stopped moving, depending on where that name was attached. Imani looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away and kept moving. She was not going to walk up to Dante Moretti at a wedding and say, "Hey, I'm the woman who found you in that warehouse. Remember me? Things have been rough, so if you ever wanted to..." No. She had not stayed beside a bleeding stranger in a smoke-filled building because she expected anything in return. She had done it because he was hurt and needed help, and she was there. That was the whole of it. The fact that he had turned out to be someone who ran half of Chicago's underworld was not her business, and it was certainly not her opening. She moved to the far side of the room and did not look at the head table again. That was when Vanessa appeared beside her assistant, a young woman named Priya who had been flinching her way through the evening like someone walking on ice she wasn't sure would hold. Imani noticed them without trying to notice them. They were near the staff corridor entrance, speaking in the low, tight tones of a conversation that needed to end before someone walked by. Imani couldn't hear the words. She wasn't close enough. But she saw Vanessa press something small and wrapped in a cloth into Priya's hand. She saw Priya look down at it and then look up with an expression that Imani recognized. The expression of someone who knows they are being asked to do something wrong and has not yet decided if they are brave enough to refuse. They both disappeared into the corridor. Imani stood with her mop for a moment. She looked at the notebook in her pocket. She thought about Jerome's baby, about Cecilia's knees. about the payroll sheets with 47 names and 14 real people. She thought about the look on Vanessa's face after the electrical system failed. She thought about Priya's expression. She went back to mopping, but she positioned herself near the service corridor entrance, and she noted the time. 14 minutes later, Vanessa walked to the center of the ballroom floor, raised her hand for the DJ to cut the music, and announced in a clear, carrying voice that a piece of jewelry belonging to the Moretti family had gone missing, and that before any accusations were made, she simply needed everyone's cooperation while she addressed the matter with the temporary staff. 300 people turned in the same direction. Security, 2 large men from the private firm Vanessa had contracted, moved toward the cluster of workers near the east wall, moved toward Imani. She felt it before she fully understood it, the way the room oriented itself, the way the walls seemed to come closer. Her apron, Vanessa said. Quietly enough that it sounded like she didn't want to say it. Loudly enough that everyone heard. I was informed there may be cause to check. Imani's hands were completely still. You have every right to check, she said, but I want a witness from the temp agency present, and I want to know what security footage you're pulling before anything is removed from my person. Vanessa's expression shifted in a way that most of the room probably missed. A micro-adjustment. Something that had been prepared for pushback and still didn't like receiving it. Of course, she said. The security guard reached for Imani's apron pocket. His hand closed around the brooch and drew it out in one motion, holding it up in the light where the crystals caught the chandeliers and scattered blue and white fire across the marble floor. The room made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp. It was something more complicated than that. It was the sound of 300 people deciding something simultaneously. Imani felt her whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I didn't take that, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. She had learned, the hard way, in a courtroom 7 years ago, over something that was also not her fault. That when your voice shakes, people hear the shake and not the words. That was placed in my apron. I want the security footage from the staff corridor in the last 30 minutes. There's really no need to, Vanessa began. There is need. Imani turned her head and looked directly at the security guard who still had the brooch in his hand. You work for this venue, not for her company. I'm formally requesting footage preservation of the staff corridor from the past 45 minutes. That is a reasonable request, and I'm making it now, in front of witnesses. The guard looked at Vanessa. That was all Imani needed to see. She was on her own. The guard's partner moved to take her arm, grabbing at the shoulder. The left one, the one with the old rotator cuff injury from the warehouse, from 12 years ago, from the night she'd spent braced against a concrete beam, trying to keep a bleeding 22-year-old still while his people panicked around her. And the pain was immediate and specific, and she made a sound she hadn't planned to make. Don't. She turned toward him, not pulling away but making him feel the wrongness of the grip. Don't drag me. Support the shoulder before you move me. The ballroom went very quiet. Not because of the words, because of a voice from the head table. Imani. She didn't move. She made herself not turn immediately. She made herself breathe. Dante Moretti was standing. He had crossed half the room without anyone registering the movement, which was either remarkable or terrifying depending on where you were standing, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could not read at all. Not because it was empty, but because there was too much in it, and it had all arrived at once. The scar near her eyebrow, the way she'd told his men to stop moving him. Don't drag him. Support the neck before you move him. He'd been barely conscious, he'd heard it anyway. She had not known, until this moment, that he remembered. You know her, Mr. Moretti? Vanessa's voice had gone a very careful kind of neutral. Dante looked at Vanessa for a long moment. Then he looked back at Imani, and something in his face settled into something she recognized from the warehouse. Not calm, exactly, but the decision that comes just before action. The thing that happens when someone who has been watching finally decides to move. She saved my life, he said. The chandeliers went on throwing their cold light across the marble. The music stayed silent. 300 phones that had been raised now slowly, one by one, began to lower. And Vanessa Rourke, who had spent 11 years learning to read power the way Imani had spent the same years learning to read rooms, felt for the first time that evening the specific horrible sensation of having miscalculated which woman in the room was the dangerous one. Imani looked at Dante. She thought about the warehouse. She thought about the notebook in her pocket. She thought about Priya's face when Vanessa pressed that brooch into her hand. She thought about how easy it would be to let him fix this, to let the weight of his name settle over the room like a verdict. "You knowing me doesn't prove I didn't steal it," she said. Dante went still. "Check the evidence," she said. And for just a moment, one moment that nobody else in that ballroom could see, because nobody else was looking at exactly the right thing, the feared head of the Moretti syndicate looked at a woman in a broken apron with a safety pin holding it closed, and something that might have been respect moved quietly across his face. Then he turned to the room. "Lock the doors," he said. "Nobody leaves until we pull the footage." The doors closed with a sound that was almost polite. Not the slam of a prison gate, not the theatrical crash of a man asserting dominance, just the soft, hydraulic exhale of heavy doors. Finding their frames, one after another, around the perimeter of the Harrington Grand Ballroom as Dante Moretti's people, and there were more of them in that room than anyone had noticed until this moment, moved to each exit with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before in rooms where the stakes were considerably higher. 300 guests, one ballroom, no one leaving. The murmur that moved through the crowd was not panic, not yet. It was something more controlled than panic and more dangerous. The low, collective sound of wealthy people recalibrating their understanding of a situation they thought they had already understood. Vanessa Rourke stood in the center of the marble floor and did not move. Her tablet was still in her hand. Her headset was still on. From a distance, she might have looked like a woman waiting for the next item on her event checklist. Up close, if you knew where to look, at the tendons in her jaw, at the way her thumb had gone completely still against the tablet's edge, she looked like someone who had just watched a controlled demolition begin and realized too late that she was standing inside the building. Imani was watching her from across the room. Not obviously. She was good at not watching people obviously. It was a skill she'd developed over years of working in spaces where she wasn't supposed to have opinions, which meant she'd had to develop the ability to gather information without appearing to gather it. Her head was tilted slightly forward. Her hands were at her sides. She looked like a woman waiting for the situation to resolve itself. She was actually cataloging every micro-movement on Vanessa's face. The security guard who had grabbed her shoulder was now standing 2 feet away, not touching her, which was an improvement. The brooch was in his hand, wrapped in the cloth he'd produced from somewhere. Good instinct, actually, preserving the surface, though whether he'd done it for investigative reasons or just because he didn't want to hold jewelry was unclear. The second guard had positioned himself between Imani and the nearest exit, which she noted and filed away. Dante had not come closer. He stood where he'd stopped, maybe 8 feet from her, and he was looking at Vanessa with an expression that Imani couldn't fully read because she was deliberately not looking directly at him. She'd learned that too. How to observe someone from the edges of your vision without giving them the information that you were observing them. "Mr. Moretti." Vanessa's voice had recovered. Imani had to give her credit for that. The woman had been badly startled, and she'd taken maybe 40 seconds to recalibrate, and now her tone was back to the professional register she'd been working in all evening. Controlled. Deferential in the specific way that powerful people are deferential to more powerful people, acknowledging the hierarchy while subtly resisting its application to them specifically. "I understand your connection to this woman is meaningful to you, truly, but what we found in her apron was found in her apron," Dante said, "which isn't the same thing as her putting it there." Vanessa paused. Just a beat. Just long enough for Imani to see her recalculate. "Of course," Vanessa said, "and I have no desire to rush a conclusion. I simply want to make sure we're handling this appropriately, given that the jewelry belongs to your family." "My aunt's jewelry," Dante said, "which she reported missing 40 minutes ago, which you told her was probably misplaced." Another pause. Longer this time. "I told her we'd look into it discreetly," Vanessa said. "I didn't want to disrupt." "You told a member of my family that her concern wasn't urgent." Dante's voice hadn't changed volume or pace. That was the thing about him that Imani remembered from the warehouse. Even badly hurt, barely conscious, he'd had that quality. The voice that didn't need to get louder to get heavier. "Then you waited until the room was full and announced the missing jewelry in front of 300 people with a cleaning worker already identified as your suspect. That's not discreet. That's a performance." Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it. "Pull the footage," Dante said. Not to Vanessa. to a man standing near the service corridor, compact, gray-suited, someone who had not been introduced and did not appear on any event staff list. East corridor, past 90 minutes. We don't have direct access to the venues, the head of security for the private firm began. The venue does, Dante said. Get the venue's security manager. There was a moment, a breath, maybe two, where Imani could see three different people in the room do the same calculation simultaneously. The private security head, Gary, who had materialized near the edge of the crowd with the expression of a man regretting every decision that had led to this moment, and Vanessa, who was still standing in the center of the floor like a woman who had not yet admitted to herself that she needed to move. What broke the moment was Jerome. He came from the left side of the room, near the bar station where he'd been positioned for the last 2 hours. And he was walking faster than service staff were supposed to walk, and his face was doing something complicated. He stopped 3 feet from Imani and spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. "They're saying you took it." "I know," she said. "Did you?" He stopped, looked at her. He had been a stranger 4 hours ago. "No, you didn't. Jerome." She kept her voice flat, calm. She needed him calm. "Go back to your station." "I'm not going back to my—" "Jerome." She looked at him directly for the first time. "I need you at your station because if this turns into a situation where the workers are scattered and unsupervised, we lose our witness base. Go. Back. Stay visible. Don't let anyone move you somewhere private." He stared at her. He was 24 years old and had a 2-week-old daughter and needed this paycheck and had no idea what was happening. "Okay," he said, and went back. Dante had heard it. She could tell by the way his attention shifted toward her without him visibly shifting. That same peripheral awareness she'd noticed on him before, that thing where his focus moved without his body announcing it. She didn't look at him. The venue's security manager was a woman named Harriet Cho, and she arrived in the ballroom with the specific energy of someone who had been in the middle of something entirely different and was furious about the interruption, but was also, under that fury, quietly terrified about what she was walking into. She was 50-something, gray at her temples, wearing the venue's management blazer over what appeared to be a dinner she'd been eating when she got the call, because there was a small stain on the lapel that she clearly hadn't noticed yet. She looked at Dante. She looked at Vanessa. She looked at Imani. She looked at the brooch in the security guard's hand. "Someone explain this to me in under 2 minutes," she said. Vanessa started to speak. "Her," Harriet said, pointing at Imani. "You, 2 minutes." Imani laid it out. Time of the announcement. Location where security had found the brooch. The specific way the search had been initiated, at Vanessa's direction, with her stating there was cause to check before any formal complaint had been filed. The request for footage she'd made in front of witnesses. The failure to have a staffing agency representative present during the search. Harriet's expression, as Imani spoke, cycled through several phases. Imani watched them the way she'd been watching faces all evening. Phase 1. Skepticism. A cleaner was telling her how to run her venue's security protocols. Phase 2. Recognition. The cleaner was right about the protocols. Phase 3. Something that wasn't quite alarm but was adjacent to it. "We have cameras in the service corridors," Harriet said. She said it to the room generally, but she was looking at Vanessa when she said it. "Full coverage. The system timestamps continuously." "Then let's pull it," Imani said. Vanessa said, "I think we need to be careful about—" "Let's pull it," Dante said. Vanessa said nothing else. They moved to a side room adjacent to the ballroom. Not the main event space, but one of the private reception alcoves that had been set up for family use earlier in the evening and was now empty. Harriet, Dante, Imani. Vanessa, who had apparently decided that absence was more damning than presence. One of Dante's gray-suited people. The security guard who still had the brooch. And Priya, who had been brought from the corridor by one of Dante's people, and who had not said a single word since entering the room, and whose face had gone the color of something that had been left in the refrigerator too long. The footage was accessible on Harriet's tablet. She pulled up the East Corridor feed. The timestamp ran in the upper corner. Harriet scrolled to 40 minutes before Vanessa's announcement. They watched. The corridor was empty. Then it wasn't. Priya appeared, walking from the direction of the event coordination workspace. She was carrying something wrapped in cloth, held against her side with one arm, in the way that people carry things when they're trying not to look like they're carrying something, which is the surest way to look like you're carrying something. She went to the staff room door, entered. The camera angle didn't cover the interior. There was a gap in coverage there, which Imani noted and suspected Vanessa had been aware of. 43 seconds. Then Priya came out. She was not carrying anything against her side anymore. Vanessa, standing slightly behind Harriet, said, "That proves she was in the room. It doesn't prove what she was doing." "She was in the room with the brooch and came out without it," Dante said. 43 seconds after your announcement that the jewelry was missing, Imani's apron was searched. The timeline is the footage," Harriet said, and her voice had changed. It had gone from crisis management neutral to something with an edge in it. She was looking at the stain on her own lapel, which she had now noticed, and her expression suggested she was recalibrating something more fundamental than the evening's events. Priya made a sound. Not a word. Not quite. A small, compressed sound, like something trying to get out of a space that was too small for it. Everyone looked at her. "Priya," Vanessa said. Her voice was very quiet and very controlled. "You don't need to—" "She told me to put it in the apron with the broken strap," Priya said. The room went still in a specific way. The kind of still that isn't absence of movement, but is rather everyone simultaneously deciding not to move. "Priya," Vanessa's voice had dropped further. "Think about what you're saying." She showed me which one. Priya wasn't looking at Vanessa. She was looking at a fixed point on the wall, the way people look when they've decided to say something and are saying it to the wall because they can't say it to the room. She said it had a broken strap, the safety pin one. She said to put it in the front pocket and make sure it was visible but not too visible. Imani's right hand was at her side. The apron hung from her neck and waist, and the safety pin was still there, still half done, same as it had been since she'd picked it up at the start of the shift. She had not closed it fully. She had pressed it shut with her thumb and told herself it would hold. Vanessa had known about the broken strap. She had seen it before the shift began. She had chosen that apron specifically. "That is a serious accusation," Vanessa said. Her voice was very controlled, and she was looking at Priya with an expression that Imani recognized. The expression of someone deciding whether the damage is containable. "And I want you to understand the implications of making it." "I understand them," Priya said. Her voice was shaking, but she wasn't stopping. She said the cleaner was going to ruin everything. She said she'd been watching her all night, and she needed her gone before the end of the event. Imani had been watching her all night. She turned that over. She thought about the payroll sheets, the 47 workers, the 14 who actually existed. She thought about Vanessa's face after the electrical system failed. She thought about the moment in the corridor when she'd seen Vanessa press the brooch into Priya's hand. Vanessa had not been watching her because she recognized the danger of a woman who had documented labor violations. She had been watching her because Imani had been watching the room. And in that room, Imani had been looking at Dante Moretti for exactly 3 seconds before she looked away. And Vanessa, who was a woman who had spent her entire career reading rooms for power dynamics, had seen it and misread it completely. She had thought Imani was going to approach him. She had thought the cleaner knew the Moretti boss and was going to use that connection to expose what Vanessa was doing with the payroll. She had not known that Imani had looked away because she refused to use it. That was the thing. That was the entire thing, and it was almost unbearable in its irony. Vanessa had destroyed a woman trying to protect herself from a threat that had never existed, that would never have existed, because the woman she was trying to destroy was the specific kind of stubborn that refused to use connections as weapons, even when she had them. Imani did not say any of this aloud. She said, "I'd like to verify the payroll documentation for tonight's event." The shift in the room was immediate and physical. Harriet looked at her sharply. Vanessa turned. And for the first time all evening, Imani saw genuine fear on Vanessa Rourke's face. Not the recalculating concern of earlier, not the controlled alarm of someone managing a situation that had gotten complicated. Fear. The specific, visceral fear of someone who has just heard the one question that unravels everything else. "What does payroll have to do with," Harriet began. "Tonight's authorization sheets list 47 workers," Imani said. "There are 14 of us on the physical sign-in log at the service entrance. I saw both documents. That's a gap of 33 people's wages that were either budgeted or billed to the client and didn't go to workers." Silence. "I want to know where that money went," Imani said. "Because the people in this room who actually worked tonight, Jerome and Cecilia and Darius and 9 others. Some of them signed documents acknowledging payment they haven't received yet, under pressure, before the event started. I watched it happen. Dante was very still. "You documented this," he said. Not a question. "My notebook's in my back pocket," she said. Times, names, observations, everything from the water leak to the payroll discrepancy to the staff corridor. I've been writing it down since before the event began. There was a beat where everyone in the room was doing math simultaneously. Harriet was doing venue liability math. Dante's gray-suited man was doing a different kind of math entirely. Priya was doing the math of having already committed and knowing there was no path backward that was shorter than the one forward. And Vanessa was doing the math of a woman who had spent 11 years building something very carefully and had just watched one temporary cleaner with a torn glove and a notebook dismantle the load-bearing wall. "I want to call my attorney," Vanessa said. "You're welcome to," Harriet said. Her voice was flat and even and contained something that sounded remarkably like relief. The relief of someone who had been running a venue where something very wrong had been happening and had just been given away to not be the person responsible for it. "But no one is leaving this building until we've had a conversation with the venue's legal team about what we've got on this footage and in this notebook. I haven't consented to any—" "The footage is the venue's property," Harriet said. "The authorization sheets are in a workspace on venue premises. And 300 guests just watched your staff search an employee without proper procedure in the middle of a private event in front of cameras I now know were rolling." She took a breath. "We're going to need to talk about all of it." Vanessa looked at Imani. It was a long look, the kind of look that tries to communicate something that can't be said in a room full of witnesses. Imani couldn't tell if it was a threat or a plea or just the naked face of a person realizing that the version of this evening they had planned and rehearsed and executed was now entirely beyond their control. Imani looked back at her. She did not say anything. The ballroom, when Imani returned to it, had changed in the way that contained spaces change when the people inside them have been waiting too long without information. The conversations had subdivided, small clusters, each running its own version of events, each version slightly different from the one beside it. She could feel the versions competing from across the room. The workers had gathered near the east wall without anyone organizing them to do so. Jerome was there, and Cecilia, and Darius, who had somehow ended up in the center of the group despite being the youngest and least experienced person in it. There was a woman named Fatima who worked for a different agency and had not said a word to anyone all evening and was now talking in a low, rapid voice to Cecilia, and whatever she was saying had Cecilia nodding in a way that was slow and deliberate and full of something that had been building for a long time. Imani crossed the ballroom floor and stood with them. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, which was its own kind of statement, and after a moment Jerome said quietly, "They're actually going to check the footage?" "They're checking it now." "And the payroll thing you said?" "Also being looked at." Jerome was quiet for a moment, then, "I signed one of those forms. At the start of the shift, Gary told me it was just acknowledgement that I'd received the briefing, but when I read it—" He stopped. "I didn't read it. I should have read it. It was the start of the shift, and I needed the job, and he was standing there." "I know," she said. "Is that going to—" "The form doesn't override the labor law," she said. "And you signed under pressure at the start of a shift without adequate time to review. That's its own problem," Cecilia said, without looking up. "How do you know all this?" "I spent 3 years in accounts receivable," Imani said, "and 2 years before that doing intake at a legal aid office. I've seen a lot of paperwork that was designed to be signed fast." Fatima looked at her. "You've been writing things down all night?" "Yes." "Why?" Imani thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer involved 12 years of her life, a warehouse in a part of Chicago she hadn't been back to since, and the specific knowledge of what it costs to have information and do nothing with it and then live with the consequences of that silence. The honest answer involved the fact that she had once watched men with power do careless, damaging things to people who didn't have enough power to protect themselves, and she had tried to address it through the right channels, and she had lost her job and spent years rebuilding, and she had told herself that the lesson was to keep her head down. She had believed that lesson for a long time. She was not sure she believed it anymore. Because someone needed to, she said. Fatima looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and went back to the conversation with Cecilia. Dante found her 20 minutes later. She was mopping. She had gone back to mopping because the floor still needed doing and because she was getting paid until 11 and because she was not sure what else to do with her hands. It was also, she acknowledged privately, the most visible possible way to communicate something to a room full of people who had spent the last hour deciding what to think about her. Namely, that she was not a person who stopped working because things got dramatic. He came and stood near her, not in her way, off to the side in the way of someone who understood that she was working and was choosing to be present without interrupting it. She kept mopping. "You should have come to me," he said. She moved the mop. The figure-8 pattern. "Should I have?" When you saw her at the corridor with the jewelry, you knew what she was doing. "I suspected." "You could have—" "What?" She stopped. She looked at him directly for the first time since the ballroom floor, and she was aware that it was the first time she'd done it, and she was also aware that she'd been avoiding it for reasons she hadn't entirely examined. Walk up to you in the middle of your family's wedding and say, "Hey, your event coordinator might be framing me, and also there's a payroll problem, and also 12 years ago I found you in a warehouse." He was quiet. "I wasn't going to do that," she said. "Why not?" "Because that's not why I helped you that night." She turned back to the mop. "I wasn't building credit." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but the kind that exists between people when something has been said that is too true to immediately respond to. "I know that," Dante said. "Then you know why I didn't come to you." He was quiet for another moment. "The payroll documentation. How much?" "I'm not an accountant, but based on the worker count and the standard temp agency rates for this size of event, if those numbers are real, you're looking at significant theft from your family and from the workers. And she targeted you because she thought I was going to expose her." Imani paused. "She saw me looking at you and she misread what it meant. She thought I knew you and was going to use that." Something moved across his face. "She was trying to destroy you," he said, "to prevent you from doing something you weren't even going to do." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. "The workers who signed the acknowledgement forms," he said, "Jerome, the others, need to be told their rights, and they need the wages they're owed regardless of what those forms say, because those forms aren't valid." "I'll make sure of it." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "That's not your debt to pay. Those workers need to understand that the forms don't hold so that next time, in the next event, with the next Vanessa, they know what to do. Giving them money fixes tonight. It doesn't fix the pattern." He looked at her with an expression she still couldn't quite name. What would fix the pattern? She thought about it. She had been thinking about it, in pieces, all evening, between the payroll sheets and Jerome's face and Cecilia's knees, and the moment she'd stood in the ballroom with a brooch in the security guard's hand and 300 phones recording her. "Training," she said, "what their rights are, what to look for, what to document, how to document it so it holds up. I know it's not simple. I was going to say that's something that could exist." He looked at her carefully. "If someone built it—" She looked at him. She did not say anything. "I have resources," he said. "I know what you have." "Then you know it would be— It's not a conversation for tonight," she said. "Tonight there's still evidence to preserve and workers who need to know what's happening, and a woman in that back room who's deciding how much to admit to." He accepted this. That surprised her slightly. Not that he accepted it, but the speed with which he did, without pushing, without redirecting. She'd expected more of a negotiation. "The footage," he said. "Harriet's security team is pulling everything. My financial advisor is looking at the event accounts." "Good." "Vanessa is claiming the payroll discrepancy is an administrative error." "It's not." "I know." He paused. "Priya's story is consistent with the footage. Vanessa's attorney is telling her not to confirm or deny." "What does Vanessa want to do?" "She offered, through her attorney, to make a settlement payment to the workers if the matter is handled privately." Imani was quiet for a moment. "And the accusation against me?" "She's prepared to retract it publicly and attribute it to a misunderstanding. The mop, the marble, the figure-8. She wants it buried," Imani said. "Yes." And what do you want? He looked at her. What do you want? She thought about that for longer than he probably expected. What she wanted was not complicated, but it was not simple either. She wanted the workers to get paid. She wanted Jerome to be able to go home to his 2-week-old daughter without the anxiety of an unsigned wage claim sitting on top of everything else. She wanted Cecilia to not have to sign something she didn't understand under time pressure in a corridor before a shift. She wanted the form with her name on it that called her a thief to not exist in a filing cabinet somewhere. She also wanted something else, something that was harder to articulate and felt, in this specific moment, more important than any of the concrete things. She wanted what had happened tonight to mean something beyond tonight. I want the evidence preserved, she said. All of it, properly. Dante nodded. And I want the other workers in the room when whatever happens next happens. Not separated. Not managed. She looked at him. This happened to them too. Okay. I'm not done mopping, she said. He looked at the mop. He looked at the floor. There was something in his expression that she thought might have been the closest thing he ever got to something that surprised him. He stepped back, out of the path of her work. She kept mopping. It was while she was working her way back toward the east wall that she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic. Just Vanessa's voice carrying from the partially open door of the side alcove, the one where Harriet and the attorneys had relocated, the one that should have been closed but wasn't because someone had propped it open with a chair and hadn't noticed. Can't be held responsible for an assistant's independent actions. And then her attorney's voice, lower, urgent. Vanessa, stop. Stop talking. And then Vanessa again, and her voice had changed, had lost the professional register entirely and become something rawer and more honest than anything Imani had heard from her all evening. She was going to destroy everything. I spent 11 years building this company. 11 years. And some cleaner with a notebook was going to walk out of here and take it apart. Silence from the attorney. I needed the Moretti contract, Vanessa said. If I lost it, the company was already... She stopped. I just needed her gone. Imani stood with her mop in the corridor outside a door that should have been closed. She had what she needed. She thought about walking away. She thought about how easy it would be to simply move back to the ballroom and let the attorneys and the footage and the payroll records do what they were going to do regardless. She thought about Priya, who had carried that brooch down a corridor for 43 seconds and come out of it without her conscience intact, and would be carrying that for a long time regardless of what happened tonight. She thought about this version of herself that had once given testimony in a different room, about a different warehouse, and had lost her job for it, and had spent years being absolutely certain that speaking up was the thing that had broken her life. She thought about whether that was actually true. She turned and walked back to the ballroom. In the center of the marble floor, 300 guests were still waiting. Jerome was at his station. Cecilia was sitting in a chair that someone had found for her, which told Imani that her knees had finally made their position known. Darius was standing with his back very straight in the specific way of young men who are holding themselves together by posture alone. Harriet appeared in the doorway of the alcove. She looked at Imani with an expression that was the most honest thing she'd worn all evening. "We have a problem," she said. "More than one," Imani said. "Vanessa's attorney is saying she'll contest the footage interpretation. He's also saying that anything Priya said was coerced by the circumstances. The payroll records are going to take more than tonight to unpack." Harriet rubbed her temple. "She's not wrong that an administrative error is technically a possible explanation." Imani was quiet. "Without something more direct," Harriet said carefully, "it becomes her word against Priya's. And Priya is an employee with a history of following Vanessa's instructions, which her attorney will use to argue she's an unreliable witness." The marble floor was very clean at this point. Imani had mopped it 3 times. "Then we need the workers," Imani said. Harriet looked at her. "All of them. Talking. Now." Imani set the mop against the wall. "Because what happened to me tonight happened to them in smaller ways over the entire shift. And I've got some of it in my notebook, but they've got the rest of it in their memories. And if Vanessa's attorney is going to argue about interpretation, then we need to build the full picture tonight, while everyone's still here, before anyone gets separated and managed and told by someone else what they saw." Harriet said, "That's going to turn this into something much larger." "It already is something much larger." Imani looked at her. "You know what those payroll sheets mean, and you know it didn't start tonight." Harriet looked at her for a long time. The door to the alcove opened wider. Vanessa stepped out. She had removed her headset. Her hair was slightly less perfect than it had been. She looked at Imani from across the marble floor with the expression of a woman who had just understood, with total and devastating clarity, that the cleaner she had tried to remove from the room 3 hours ago was now the fixed point around which everything else was rotating. "I want to talk to her," Vanessa said. Not to her attorney, not to Harriet. To the room. Her attorney said, "Vanessa, I strongly advise—" "Alone," Vanessa said, still looking at Imani. Imani looked back at her. The smart move was no. The smart move was to say that anything said between them needed witnesses, needed documentation, needed to happen in a room with a recording and proper parties present. The smart move was to protect herself the way she'd been protecting herself all evening, carefully, methodically, with documentation. Imani had spent 12 years making the smart move. She looked at Vanessa Rourke and she saw something she hadn't expected to see, a woman who was terrified, not of the consequences, not of the evidence, terrified of being seen, of having the gap between who she believed herself to be and what she had actually done made visible and irrevocable. Imani understood that particular terror. She didn't have to be kind about it, but she wasn't sure she was capable of being otherwise. 2 minutes, she said, in front of the room. I'm not going anywhere private with you. Vanessa's attorney said her name again. Vanessa ignored him and walked toward the center of the marble floor, and Imani walked toward her from the other side. And the room, 300 people and 14 workers and one mafia boss and a venue security manager and a young woman named Priya who had been trying to disappear into the wall for the last half hour, went absolutely and completely silent. Vanessa stopped 4 feet away from her, not close enough to touch, not far enough to pretend this was anything other than what it was. 2 women standing in the center of a marble floor with 300 people watching and nowhere left to perform for either of them. Up close, Imani could see things she hadn't been able to see from across the room. The mascara that had traveled slightly below Vanessa's left eye. The way her chest was moving. Not the controlled breathing of a woman in command of a situation, but the shallower, faster rhythm of someone running on adrenaline that was starting to thin. The hand at her side that was pressing her thumbnail into her index finger over and over, in the same spot, the kind of repetitive physical tic that people develop without knowing they've developed it. Vanessa Rourke was coming apart at the seams, and she was the only person in the room who hadn't admitted it yet. "I want you to understand something," Vanessa said. Her voice was low. Not low enough. The ballroom's acoustics were designed to carry sound, had been designed that way for 100 years, and the silence around them was so complete that Imani suspected even the guests at the back wall could hear most of what was said. But Vanessa was speaking as though they were alone, and Imani decided to let her believe it. "I want you to understand," Vanessa said again, "that none of this was personal." Imani looked at her. "I know how that sounds," Vanessa said. "I know. But you have to understand what was at stake. 11 years. Do you know what 11 years of building something looks like? The contracts you fight for, the people you hire and train, and the reputation you construct from nothing, from absolutely nothing, because nobody hands you anything in this industry, nobody—" She stopped. Her thumbnail pressed into her finger again. "I had 3 contracts pending on the outcome of this event. 3. One of them was worth more than my entire operating budget for the year. And when I saw you looking at him—" "Stop," Imani said. Vanessa stopped. "I'm going to tell you what I saw," Imani said. Her voice was level. "And then you're going to tell me if I'm wrong." Vanessa said nothing. "You inflated your worker count on the authorization sheets. You billed your client for 47 workers and hired 14. The difference? 33 workers' wages, plus meal provisions, plus overtime allocations went somewhere else. Into your operating budget, or into debt payments, or into the gap between what your company was earning and what it needed to survive." Imani watched Vanessa's face. "You've been doing it for a while. Tonight wasn't the first time. But tonight was different because the client is the Moretti family, and the event was high profile enough that you needed clean documentation, and you needed the workers who were actually here to sign forms that would serve as cover if anyone looked at the numbers." Vanessa's thumbnail had stopped moving. "And then I found the payroll sheets," Imani said. "And you saw me looking at Dante, and you made a decision." The silence between them was very long. You're not wrong, Vanessa said. It was the last thing Imani expected her to say. She'd expected denial, deflection, the careful language of a woman whose attorney was standing 12 feet away trying to communicate through eye contact. She had not expected the flat, exhausted truth of those 3 words, delivered without the professional register, without the controlled tone, without anything between them except the marble floor and the chandeliers still throwing their cold light over everything. I know, Vanessa said. I know I'm not wrong. That's the thing I can't. She stopped again. Something crossed her face that Imani recognized, though it took her a moment to place it. It was the expression of a person who has been holding a version of themselves together for so long that the effort of holding it has become indistinguishable from the self until it breaks, and then they can't remember what was underneath. I've been running the company at a loss for 18 months. The big contracts kept promising and not closing. I had 12 employees, 12 people with families and mortgages, and I was the only thing standing between them and layoffs, and you stole from the people who had the least to begin with, Imani said. Vanessa flinched. Jerome needed overtime to cover his wife's medical bills from the delivery, Imani said. Cecilia is 63 and her knees are bad, and she needed this paycheck to cover next month's rent. Darius is 20 years old, and this was going to be his first professional reference. Those are the people you took from. Not a corporation, not a line item. Them. I know, Vanessa said, and her voice had gone somewhere very small. And then you tried to make me a thief in front of 300 people, Imani said, to protect a fraud. Vanessa looked at the floor. She looked at the marble that Imani had mopped 3 times over the course of the evening. She looked at the brooch that was still in the security guard's hand across the room, catching the chandeliers in its sapphire face. What do you want from me? She said. I told Harriet what I want, Imani said. The workers talk. All of them. Tonight. The full picture gets documented. She paused. And you tell the truth about what you put in my apron, not a retraction, not a misunderstanding, the truth. Vanessa's attorney made a sound from across the room that was not quite a word but was definitely a warning. Vanessa did not look at him. And if I do that, she said, what happens to my company? I don't know, Imani said. That's not my decision. It's his decision. Vanessa glanced toward Dante, who had not moved, who was standing near the alcove entrance with his arms loosely at his sides, in the posture of a man with nowhere better to be. If he pulls the contracts, then he pulls the contracts, Imani said. That's what happens when you steal from people. Vanessa looked at her. The mascara had moved further now, a slow, dark track. She didn't wipe it. Maybe she didn't know it was there. Maybe she had simply run out of the energy required to manage her own appearance. I thought you were going to him, she said. I watched you look at him, and I thought, I know what you thought. Were you? If I hadn't, were you going to tell him about the payroll? Imani considered lying. It would have been easy. It would have been the kind of easy that felt like power. The simple lie that confirmed the worst interpretation, that let Vanessa believe her instincts had been correct, even if her methods had been catastrophic. No, Imani said. I wasn't. Vanessa closed her eyes. I was going to finish my shift and collect my paycheck and go home, Imani said. And then I was going to call the labor board. The sound that came out of Vanessa then was not a laugh and not a sob, but something occupying the uncomfortable territory between them. A short, broken exhale. The sound of someone understanding the precise dimensions of their own mistake. If you'd just done your job, she said. To herself, really. Not to Imani. If I just... She stopped. You were going to call the labor board. Yes. Not him. No. 11 years, Vanessa said. And then she said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say about it that the silence didn't say better. The workers talked for 2 hours. Harriet brought in the venue's own HR liaison, a tired-looking man named Bernard, who arrived with a laptop and an expression suggesting he'd been through this kind of thing before and had opinions about it that he was professionally required to suppress. Dante's financial advisor, a quiet, precise woman named Lynn, who had appeared from somewhere unannounced and whose presence suggested that Dante had anticipated needing her, set up at the side table with the event's account records. Imani sat in the corner and gave her notebook to Bernard. Jerome talked first. He was good at it, actually, clear and sequential, the kind of person who narrates naturally because he processes things by describing them. He laid out the sign-in procedure, the form he'd been asked to sign, the conversation with Gary about overtime, the meal that had been promised at 8 and arrived at 10 as a bag of crackers and 2 granola bars split among 14 people. Then Cecilia. She was slower, more careful, choosing her words with the deliberateness of someone who had learned from experience that being believed required precision. She had worked 12 events for different companies through the same staffing agency over the past 2 years. 3 of them had involved similar paperwork irregularities. She had not reported any of them because she had not believed it would change anything. "I believe it now," she said. Not to anyone in particular. Just said it to the room. Darius, when it was his turn, was shaking. Not with fear exactly. With the particular agitation of a young man who has been told throughout his short working life that the right thing to do is keep your head down and not cause trouble, and who is currently being asked to directly contradict that instruction in a room full of powerful people. He got through it. His account was brief and factual, and when he finished, he looked at Imani with an expression that asked, wordlessly, whether he'd done it right. She gave him a small nod. He exhaled. Fatima's account was the one that changed the room. She was quieter than the others, and she spoke with the specific carefulness of someone for whom English was a third language. Precise, because imprecision in a third language costs you credibility you can't afford to lose. She had worked for Vanessa's company before, not as a temp. 6 months ago, as a permanent hire. She had lasted 3 weeks before she was let go for what Vanessa had described as performance issues. "What were the performance issues?" Lynn asked. Fatima looked at her hands. "I asked about the payroll records. I was processing invoices and I saw numbers that did not match." She looked up. "She told me I didn't understand how event billing worked, and the next week I was terminated." The room was very quiet. "Did you report it?" Bernard asked. "I filed a complaint with the staffing agency," she said. "They told me it was under review." She paused. "That was 6 months ago." Lynn made a notation on her laptop. Her face gave away nothing, but the speed with which she was typing suggested she was giving the notation a great deal of attention. Vanessa was in the alcove with her attorney. She had agreed to stay in the building. She had not agreed to anything else, and her attorney had, in the last hour, done his job correctly by saying very little on her behalf and preventing her from saying more than she should. But the thing about Fatima's account, the thing that Imani felt moved through the room like a temperature change, was that it transformed the narrative from a single evening's fraud into a pattern that had a previous employee, a previous complaint, and a staffing agency that had not followed up. That was not a cleaner stealing a brooch at a wedding. That was a paper trail. Dante was standing near the window when Lynn brought him the first summary of what the account records showed. Imani watched him read it. She watched his jaw tighten by a single degree and then release. She watched him hand it back to Lynn and say 2 words that she couldn't hear from across the room. Lynn nodded and went back to her laptop. It was Priya who undid the last thing holding the evening together. She had been sitting in a chair near the alcove entrance for the better part of the last 2 hours, and Imani had been peripherally aware of her the entire time, the way you're aware of a door that hasn't been opened, the potential of it. Priya had given her account. She had been consistent. She had not retracted or softened anything she'd said in the side room. But at some point in the second hour, something shifted. Imani noticed it first. The way Priya's posture changed, the careful, contained stillness giving way to something more agitated, her eyes moving between the workers' table and the alcove where Vanessa sat, back and forth, with the rhythm of someone running a calculation that kept coming out wrong. Jerome noticed it second. He leaned toward Imani and said, very quietly, "She looks like she's about to be sick." "I know," Imani said. "Should we?" "Give her a minute." But it wasn't a minute. It was 30 seconds, and then Priya stood up abruptly, and Bernard looked up from his laptop, and the room did the thing where everyone becomes very still. "I need to say something else," Priya said. Her attorney, she didn't have one, which Imani had noted and worried about, was not present. She was speaking into the room with nothing between her and whatever she was about to say. "Priya," Imani said. Her voice was careful. "You don't have to. She told me you were dangerous," Priya said. Not to Imani. To the room. "Vanessa, When she gave me the brooch, she said the cleaner had been causing problems all night and she'd found out you had a record. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. The ripple was immediate and physical. Imani felt it, felt the shift in attention, felt the recalibration happening simultaneously in 20 different people's minds. A record, Harriet said, carefully. A criminal record, Priya said. Vanessa told me you'd been convicted of theft before, 7 years ago. She said it was documented. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of the evening. This one had weight. This one had direction. Imani was very still, 7 years ago. She knew exactly what 7 years ago meant. She knew it the way you know the shape of a scar, by the way it pulls when the weather changes, by the specific quality of the ache that never entirely goes away. 7 years ago was a courtroom. 7 years ago was a conviction for something she had not done, in a jurisdiction where she couldn't afford the right attorney, in a case where the evidence had been assembled by people who had reason to want her silent. 7 years ago was the thing she had rebuilt her life around. Not over, around. The way a tree grows around a fence post, incorporating the obstacle into the structure, because removing it would collapse everything built on top of it. She had not lied about it. She had not volunteered it. There had been no reason to volunteer it tonight because it had nothing to do with tonight. But Vanessa had known. She had known before the shift began. She had known when she chose the apron with the broken strap. She had known, and she had held it in reserve like a secondary weapon, and she had deployed it through Priya into the room at the moment when the evidence was turning most decisively against her. Imani looked across the ballroom. She looked at Dante. He was looking back at her. She could not read his expression, and she did not try. "What was the conviction?" Bernard said. "What was the conviction?" Bernard said. It was a quiet question, administrative in tone. He was a venue HR liaison asking a procedural question, and he had every professional reason to ask it. And no amount of the reason made it any easier to stand in the center of a marble floor and answer it. "Theft," Imani said, 7 years ago, from a freight logistics company. The words sat in the room. Jerome had gone very still. Not suspicious still, she could see that. He had gone the still of someone absorbing something that complicated a picture he'd already drawn and was trying to figure out what to do with the new information without betraying anyone in the process. Cecilia looked at the floor. Fatima looked at her hands. Darius looked at Imani. His expression was unreadable in the specific way of very young people who have not yet developed the social machinery to disguise their uncertainty. He was trying to decide what to believe, and he didn't know how, and it showed on his face like weather. "Were you guilty?" Harriet said. Another quiet, procedural question. Another question with every legitimate reason behind it. "No," Imani said. "But you were convicted." "Yes." The legal distinction between those two facts was real, was significant, was the kind of thing that any reasonable person with any understanding of the justice system understood to be meaningful. It was also the kind of thing that evaporated in a room full of people who were already uncertain, already tired, already 3 hours into an evening that had asked more of them than they had agreed to give. Vanessa appeared in the alcove doorway. She had heard it. She had been sitting in that alcove with her attorney, and she had heard every word, and she had come to the doorway, not because she was going to speak. Her attorney was right behind her, his hand on her elbow, communicating a clear and urgent no. But because she wanted to see Imani's face when the room shifted. She wanted to see if it had worked. Imani looked at her. For 3 seconds, they held that look across the width of the ballroom, and Imani understood, completely and without ambiguity, what had just happened. Vanessa hadn't said the words herself. She had been careful enough to use Priya as the delivery mechanism. Priya, who was cooperative with the investigation, Priya whose account had already been found credible, Priya whose voice carried the specific authority of a reluctant truth-teller. It hadn't been an accusation, it had been a disclosure. Priya simply sharing what she'd been told, faithfully and honestly, because she was trying to be honest. It was perfect. It was the exact kind of perfect that required 11 years of practice to execute. The record changed the geometry of the room. Not the facts. The facts were the same. The footage was the same. The payroll sheets were the same. Priya's account of the alcove and the brooch and the 43 seconds was the same. But the geometry changed. The way a room full of people looked at Imani changed. And once that look changed, the credibility of everything she had documented, the notebook, The times and names and observations changed with it. Imani had been here before, not in this ballroom, not with these people, but she had been in the version of this moment where the facts she knew to be true became insufficient against the story someone else was telling about who she was. And she had lost that version, and it had cost her 7 years. She thought about running, not physically. She wasn't going to run anywhere. But the mental version of it, the retreat into silence and waiting, the passive positioning of herself as someone who would accept whatever the room decided because fighting it only made it worse. She had done that 7 years ago. She had been advised to do it by the attorney she'd been appointed in a tone that suggested he had evaluated her chances and found them poor. She had done it, and she had still lost. Dante moved. He crossed from the window to the center of the room, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the specific deliberate pace of a man who knows that the speed of his movement communicates everything about how much urgency he is or is not assigning to a situation. He stopped 10 feet from Imani and looked at her. "Tell me about the conviction," he said. Not a question exactly, an invitation. The difference was important. "It was 7 years ago," she said. "I was working accounts receivable for a freight logistics company in Pilsen. I flagged a series of internal transfers that didn't match the invoice records. I reported it to my supervisor and then to the regional director when my supervisor didn't act on it." She kept her voice even. 3 weeks later, I was accused of falsifying the same records I'd flagged. The accusation was that I'd been skimming from the accounts and had flagged the discrepancy to create documentation that would shift suspicion elsewhere. The room was listening. "The people I had reported were the people who built the case against me," she said. "I was convicted. I served no prison time. It was a suspended sentence with restitution requirements. I've paid the restitution. The conviction is on my record." "What happened to the people you reported?" Lynn said from the side table. Imani looked at her. "2 of them were later separately investigated for unrelated financial irregularities at a different company. One of them was convicted. The other took a settlement. That happened 4 years after my conviction. It had nothing legally to do with my case." Lynn was typing. "But it was the same pattern," Dante said. "Yes. You flagged financial irregularities. You were retaliated against. The retaliation included a criminal accusation." He paused. "And tonight you flagged financial irregularities." "Yes." "And you were retaliated against." "Yes." "With a criminal accusation," he said. The ballroom had gone so quiet that Imani could hear the refrigeration unit on the bar cycling on behind the east wall. Vanessa was still in the doorway. Her attorney's hand was still on her elbow. He was saying something very quietly into her ear, and she was not responding, was not acknowledging it, was simply standing in the doorway with her eyes on Imani and her face doing something complicated that Imani did not look at because she did not trust herself to look at it with anything approaching objectivity. "I can't prove a connection between the 2 events," Imani said. "Legally, I know what it looks like and I know what it is, and I cannot prove it in a way that holds up." "Not tonight," Lynn said. Everyone looked at her. Line set her laptop down on the table and folded her hands on top of it with the precise, economical movement of someone who has spent a career in rooms where precision was the only currency worth having. "The conviction record is public. The case files from 7 years ago are accessible. The company involved in the original case, do you know if it's still operating?" "It closed 2 years after my conviction," Imani said. "There were additional audits." "Triggered by what?" "I don't know," Imani said. "I stopped following it. I was trying to—" She paused. "I was trying to rebuild." Lynn looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something on a notepad that nobody else could see. Jerome said, from the workers' table, "So they set her up 7 years ago, and it worked, and then someone tried to set her up again tonight the same way." Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. "That's—" Jerome looked at Vanessa. His voice had gone somewhere harder. "You knew about the old case when you hired the cleaning company. You knew, and you thought it meant, if you needed to—" He stopped. "You had it ready. You already had it ready." Vanessa said nothing. "Jerome," Imani said. "No." He was on his feet. He was 24 years old and had a baby daughter and had signed a form he hadn't read and had worked 6 hours for wages he might not see, and something in him had reached the specific temperature where restraint becomes too expensive. "No," she knew. She knew what happened to you before, and she knew that if she planted that brooch it would— that your record would make people believe it. She used your past against you. She built the whole thing on your past." The room was very still. Vanessa's attorney said, "My client has nothing to—" "Did you know?" Dante said. He was looking at Vanessa. His voice had not changed. It was the same level tone he had used all evening, and Imani had come to understand over the course of the last 3 hours that this was more dangerous than volume, that the voice that didn't need to get louder had a quality that cut through everything that louder voices obscured. Vanessa looked at him. "Did you research her record before tonight?" Dante said. "Yes or no?" Her attorney said her name. She said, "Yes." The word fell into the room. Jerome sat back down. Not because the energy had gone out of him, she could see it hadn't, but because the confirmation had done something to him that anger couldn't, which was make him tired. The specific, bone-deep tired of someone who has just had the worst interpretation of a situation confirmed and had been hoping, quietly and without admitting it, to be wrong. Cecilia made a sound. It was small. It was the kind of sound that a person who has been sitting very still for a long time makes when something finally moves through them that is too large to hold silently. Imani looked at the floor, at the marble she had mopped, at the place where the brooch had been held up and caught the light and scattered blue and white fire across the 300 faces that had been filming her. She had been here before. She had stood in a room where the truth she knew was insufficient against the story someone else had constructed, and she had been told to be patient, to trust the process, to accept that sometimes the right outcome took time that she did not have. She had lost 7 years. She was not going to lose tonight. She turned to Bernard. "I want everything documented," she said. "Vanessa's confirmation that she researched my record before tonight. The timeline of when she accessed it relative to when she placed me in this assignment. The gap between reported and actual workers. Fatima's previous complaint and the staffing agency's failure to follow up. The footage. Priya's account. All of it." Bernard was already typing. "And I want it submitted," she said. "Tonight. Not pending review. Not under advisement. Filed." Bernard looked at Harriet. Harriet looked at Dante. Dante looked at Imani. "That becomes a formal legal matter," he said. "Once it's filed, I can't control the outcome." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to." "Vanessa's company. I know." "The workers may have to testify formally," he said. "Jerome, Cecilia, all of them." "I know." She looked at the workers' table, at Jerome, who was staring at his hands, at Cecilia, who had looked up and was watching Imani with an expression that was old and clear and understood something about the weight of this decision that most of the room did not. But they decide that themselves. She looked at Jerome directly. "You don't have to do anything you don't choose to do." Jerome looked back at her. He looked at the table. He thought about his daughter, who was 2 weeks old and asleep right now in an apartment he was behind on the rent for, and who would be 2 years old and then 12 years old and then whoever she was going to become and who would never know this room existed. He looked up. "Tell me what to sign," he said. Cecilia said, "Me too." Darius said nothing, but he stood up, which was its own answer. Fatima had been sitting with her hands folded since she'd finished speaking. She unfolded them now and placed both palms flat on the table, and she said, "I filed a complaint 6 months ago that went nowhere. I would like to file another one tonight, on record, with witnesses." And that was when Vanessa's attorney made the decision that his client's best remaining option was a controlled confession rather than a contested proceeding. Because a contested proceeding with this much witness testimony and this much documented evidence and a financial analyst already inside the account records was not a proceeding his client could survive intact. He leaned toward Vanessa and spoke for 30 seconds. She listened. She looked at the room, at Imani, at the marble floor, at the brooch still in the security guard's hand. She looked at Priya, who had given her account faithfully and honestly, and was now sitting with her arms wrapped around herself in the chair by the alcove entrance, and who would carry 43 seconds of a corridor for the rest of her professional life, regardless of what happened next. And Vanessa Rourke, who had spent 11 years building a company that survived by finding the cracks in systems and pushing through them, who had read power dynamics the way other people read weather, who had looked at a woman in a borrowed uniform and decided she could be erased, made the decision that her attorney was recommending. She walked out of the alcove doorway and into the center of the room. She said, I want to make a statement. The room waited. I accessed records regarding a temporary worker's background before tonight's event, she said. Her voice was steady in the way of something that has been broken and set and will be steady now, because the alternative is to fall apart completely. I used that information as part of a plan to discredit her in the event that she raised concerns about my company's financial practices. I directed my assistant to place my client's jewelry in that worker's apron. I did this deliberately. She paused. And I want to be clear that the worker's prior conviction has no bearing on what happened tonight. She did not steal anything. She documented what she saw because it was true, and I tried to destroy her for it. The marble floor held very still under all of them. Then Vanessa looked at Imani, and this look was different from all the other looks of the evening. It was not calculating, not desperate, not performative. It was just a look. The look of one person seeing another person clearly for what was possibly the first time, and having to sit with what that clarity revealed about themselves. "I'm sorry," she said. Imani looked at her. The apology was real. She could see that it was real, could see it in the way Vanessa's face had lost the architecture she'd been maintaining all evening, the professional structure that made her readable as someone in control. The apology was real, and it was not enough, and both of those things were true simultaneously. "I know," Imani said. She turned to Bernard. "Are you getting this?" "Everything," he said. "Then keep going," she said. "We're not done." Because the statement was the beginning of the end, but it was not the end. And what Imani had learned in 7 years of rebuilding was that the moment of confession was never the hardest part. The hardest part was what came after. The long, unglamorous, unsatisfying work of actually making it mean something, of turning a broken evening into a precedent, of making sure that Jerome's baby daughter grew up in a world where the forms were a little harder to weaponize against the people who needed the wages. She picked up her notebook. She looked at the room. 300 guests who had come for a wedding and were leaving with something considerably more complicated, 14 workers who had come for a paycheck and were staying for something they hadn't planned on, and one mafia boss standing near the window who had not looked away from her once in the past 20 minutes. And she sat down at the table beside Bernard and opened the notebook to the first page of notes she had taken that evening, and she began. The marble floor was clean. She had done that herself. It would hold whatever came next. Bernard filed the first document at 11:47. Imani knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on his laptop screen the way you watch something you've been waiting for without admitting you've been waiting for it. The upload confirmation appeared in the corner of the screen, a small, undramatic icon, the kind of thing that happened 1,000 times a day on 1,000 different laptops. And she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known she was holding. The release lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Vanessa's attorney said, "We need to talk about the scope of what's been filed," and the 4 seconds ended. His name was Garrett Ohl, and he was the kind of attorney that expensive problems generated. Not flashy, not aggressive in the theatrical way, but precise in the way of someone who had spent a career finding the load-bearing walls in other people's cases and removing them quietly. He was maybe 55, silver-haired, wearing the expression of a man who had not planned to earn his fee tonight, but had adjusted to the requirement. He stood at the end of Bernard's table, and he looked at the documents on the screen, and then he looked at Imani, and he said, "The statement my client made was made under duress, in an emotionally compromised state, without adequate legal counsel present. Its admissibility is going to be challenged." "She made it voluntarily," Harriet said. "She made it in a room controlled by a member of the Moretti family," Ola said, "in front of that family's financial analyst, after 2 hours of what could reasonably be characterized as an informal interrogation." The word landed in the room the way he'd intended it to land. Imani looked at Dante. Dante looked at Ola. "Nobody was interrogated," Dante said. "Workers were asked to give accounts without union representation, without counsel, and in a space controlled by—" "The workers chose to speak," Jerome said. Ola looked at him. "Son, don't." Jerome's voice was flat. "Don't call me son." Ola recalibrated. He had the skill of a man who had read 1,000 rooms and knew when a word had cost him something. "The workers chose to speak in a context that will be scrutinized," he said. "My concern is that anything produced tonight could be challenged as procedurally compromised, which ultimately hurts the people in this room more than it hurts my client." It was a good argument. Imani recognized it as a good argument, the way you recognize a chess move that you have to respect even while you're figuring out how to answer it. He was not wrong that the context was irregular. He was not wrong that a formal legal challenge would examine every aspect of how the evening's documentation had been gathered. He was using the legitimate concern as a weapon, which was different from the concern being illegitimate. "What are you proposing?" Lynn said. She asked it from the side table without looking up from her laptop, in the tone of someone who already knew the answer and was asking to make it official. Ola said, "A private settlement, comprehensive. Workers receive their owed wages plus a compensatory amount. The company makes restitution to the Moretti estate for the payroll discrepancy. Ms. Brooks receives a formal, documented retraction of all accusations made against her tonight, including the removal of any event record connecting her name to the jewelry incident. And Vanessa's company," Lynn said, "continues operating under restructured financial agreements." He paused. "My client is prepared to accept significant remediation requirements." "And the prior conviction," Imani said. Ole looked at her. 7 years ago," she said. "The conviction that Vanessa researched and used as a weapon tonight. Is that part of your settlement?" "That's a separate legal matter from a separate jurisdiction." "It's the foundation of what happened tonight," Imani said. "She knew about it. She used it. If your settlement doesn't address it, then you're asking everyone in this room to accept money in exchange for pretending that the most important part of this evening didn't happen." Ole was quiet for a moment. I was recalibrating again. She could see it, the slight adjustment in his posture that indicated he had encountered a variable he hadn't weighted correctly. "The conviction was in a different jurisdiction," he said carefully. "My client had no role in—" "She had knowledge," Imani said. "Documented knowledge, accessed before tonight, used as part of a deliberate plan. Whether your client caused the original conviction is separate from whether she weaponized it. Both things happened." "What exactly are you asking for?" Ola said. The room was very still. Imani looked at him. She had been asked this question twice tonight, and both times she had given answers that were careful and specific and designed to be fair, and both times she had meant them, and she still meant them now. But there was something else underneath the careful specificity that she had been aware of all evening and had not put into words, because putting it into words in a room like this, full of people who processed everything through the lens of what was achievable and what was legal and what was settleable, felt like the kind of thing that would be translated immediately into something smaller than it was. She was going to say it anyway. "I want it to mean something," she said. "Not just tonight. The workers who signed those forms before the shift, they're going to sign more forms. At the next event, with the next company, in the next corridor where someone tells them it's just an acknowledgement and there's no time to read it carefully, the forms are going to keep existing. And the people who can least afford to understand what they're signing are going to keep signing them." She looked at Ola. "A settlement that pays everyone and lets the company restructure and calls it resolved doesn't touch that. It pays the debt and leaves the system that created the debt intact." Ola said, "What you're describing is policy change. That's beyond the scope of—" "I know what it's beyond," she said. "I'm telling you what I want." "Imani," Dante's voice from near the window. She looked at him. He crossed the room. Not to her. He stopped at the center of the space between her and Ole, which was a position that gave him proximity to both without aligning himself with either, which she recognized as intentional. "What you're describing," he said, "the training, the worker education, the documentation protocols. Yes, that's buildable. I know it's buildable. Not through a legal settlement," he said. "A settlement is a document. What you're describing is an institution. Those are different instruments." She looked at him. "Are you telling me what I already know, or are you going somewhere with this?" Something moved across his face. "I'm going somewhere with it." "Then get there." He looked at her for a moment, the look of a man recalibrating something, not because he'd been wrong, but because the situation had clarified to a point where a decision that had been theoretical was becoming concrete. "The settlement covers tonight," he said. "Workers paid, restitution made. Your record, the event record from tonight, cleared and documented. Vanessa's statement preserved and on file, not sealed." He looked at Ola as he said the last part, and Ola's expression confirmed that this was a point he had intended to contest. "That's the settlement." "And the other thing," Imani said. "The other thing is separate from the settlement," Dante said. "And it's a conversation for later. Tonight, the settlement is the settlement." Ola said. If the statement is preserved and on file, it stays on file, Dante said. It's not sealed, not suppressed, not qualified. What she said, she said. It exists. That creates significant exposure for my client. Your client created significant exposure for herself, Dante said. Tonight I'm offering a path that doesn't end in a courtroom. What happens on that path is what it is. The directness of it was almost startling. Imani had watched him operate all evening with the careful economy of someone who knew exactly how much force each situation required. No more, never less. This was the most direct he had been, and it landed in the room like a dropped weight, not loud but felt in the floor. Ole looked at Vanessa. Vanessa had been standing near the alcove since her statement. She had not moved back inside and she had not come further into the room. She was standing at the threshold in the specific posture of someone who has said the hardest thing they've ever said and doesn't know what their body is supposed to do now that it's been said. She looked at Ola and gave him a very small nod. He turned back to the room. We'll accept those terms pending formal review of the document language. Tonight, Lynn said. The worker payments happen tonight. Tonight, Ola said, is logistically tonight, Dante said. The word closed the conversation. The payments took 40 minutes to arrange. Lean handled it with the focused efficiency of someone for whom large numbers moving quickly was ordinary work. Jerome received a notification on his phone, returned from Locker 14, along with everyone else's, the moment the settlement conversation began. And he stared at the number on the screen for so long that Imani thought something had gone wrong. He looked up. That's more than owed wages plus compensatory amount, Lynn said, per the settlement terms. I signed that form, he said. At the beginning of the shift. Gary told me, the form doesn't hold, Imani said. I told you that. He looked at her. He looked at his phone. He looked at the notification again, as if it might have changed. My daughter's 8 days old, he said. I know, she said. I didn't tell you that. You mentioned a 2-week-old at the beginning of the shift. I did the math. He laughed. It was a short, slightly broken sound, the laugh of someone who has been running on adrenaline for 4 hours and has just been given permission to put some of it down. He pressed his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling and then back out at the phone. Okay, he said. Okay. Cecilia received her notification and looked at it and looked at Imani and said, thank you, in a voice so quiet it was almost only breath. And Imani said, it was yours. It was always yours. And Cecilia nodded and looked at her knees and didn't say anything else. Darius received his and went very red in the face and said nothing at all, which seemed right. Fatima looked at hers for a long time and then said, the complaint I filed 6 months ago with the staffing agency. We'll follow up on it, Lynn said, formally. I want to be present when you do. You will be. It was 12 minutes past midnight when Vanessa's attorney finished reviewing the settlement language and signed on her behalf. The signature looked like the end of something, not just the document, but the specific version of Vanessa Rourke that had walked into the Harrington Grand at 3 o'clock that afternoon with a headset and a tablet and 11 years of momentum behind her. Imani signed the workers' portion alongside Bernard. Her handwriting was steady. She had made sure of that. She had learned to make sure of that. The guests had been released an hour earlier, filtered out through the main entrance in clusters after Dante's people had taken contact information for anyone who might be required as a witness. Most of them had left with the careful expressions of people who had attended a wedding and witnessed something considerably more significant and were not yet sure how to categorize the evening. A few had lingered. Imani had seen them from across the room, the ones who found reasons to stay near the edges, watching. People watched things they found significant. She had learned to take note of who stayed and who left. The bride and groom had been moved to a private suite 2 floors up at the beginning of the investigation. Dante had handled that himself, Imani gathered, with the economy of a man who understood that some things needed to be protected from the room even when the room was being served by their exposure. The wedding had been derailed. That was real. It would remain real regardless of how everything else resolved. She thought about that. About the young couple upstairs who had planned this evening for probably 2 years and had ended up inside someone else's crisis. And she felt the weight of it without knowing what to do with the weight. She set it aside. Not forever, just for now. The ballroom was nearly empty. The chandelier light seemed more present without the crowd beneath it. the crystal throwing its fire against the marble, with nothing to absorb it. The flowers on the tables were still perfect. Flowers were indifferent to everything, which Imani had always found either comforting or unbearable depending on the day. She found a chair and sat in it. This was the first time she had sat down since the shift began. Her shoulder ached in the specific deep way of an old injury that had been aggravated and was now conducting a debrief of the evening's events. Her feet ached in the way of feet that had been on marble for 9 hours. Her right hand, the one that had been writing in the notebook since before the event began, was cramped in the fingers, and when she stretched them out, the knuckles popped with a sound like small complaints. She was so tired. Not the tired of not enough sleep, the tired of having held herself in a particular configuration for a very long time, held her voice level, held her hands still, held the documentation in her head, and then in the notebook, and then spoken it into rooms full of people who needed to hear it clearly. And now the configuration could release, and what was underneath it was the ordinary human exhaustion of a 32-year-old woman who had started the night needing a paycheck. Dante sat down in the chair beside her. He didn't announce it. He just came and sat, which she had noticed was how he moved through rooms, without the social preamble that most people used to soften their arrival, without the performance of approach. He was simply elsewhere, and then he was there. She didn't look at him. She looked at the empty ballroom. The prior conviction, he said. I know. Lynn is going to look at it. I know. The company that convicted you closed, she said. I told you. The people who built the case. She was quiet for a moment. One is still in the industry, different company, different city. The other one died 2 years ago. She paused. Cancer. She hadn't known how to feel about that when she heard it. She still didn't. There may be grounds, he said. For what? An appeal, or a petition for record expungement, depending on what Lynn finds in the case files. He paused. It's not guaranteed, but the pattern, what happened tonight, creates a documented parallel that could be significant if someone looks at the original case with the right framework. She turned her head and looked at him for the first time since she'd sat down. Is that something you want? He said, or something you want me to stay out of? The question was honest. She could see that it was honest, not a performance of deference, not the elaborate courtesy of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was asking permission as a formality. He was actually asking. She thought about the 7 years, about the version of herself that had filed the original complaint and lost everything and spent 3 years believing she had been wrong to file it, about the version that had spent another 4 years understanding she hadn't been wrong, that wrong and costly could coexist, that the two things were separate in a way that nobody in her life at that time had been able to help her hold. I don't know yet, she said. Okay. That's a real answer, she said, not a deflection. I know, he said. I can wait. She looked back at the ballroom. You said the other thing, the training program, the worker education, was a conversation for later. Yes. How much later? When you're ready to have it. I might not be ready for a while. That's fine, he said. She looked at him. You're not going to push it. No. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because the last time someone was in a position to do something significant for you, they used that position to manipulate what you were willing to do. I'm not doing that. She felt something shift in the region of her sternum that was not quite pain and not quite the absence of it. The brooch, she said. My aunt has it back. I wanted it noted formally, in the settlement record, that it was recovered from the security guard's possession, not from my person, not found in my apron, recovered from the chain of custody that began with Priya. It's already in the document, he said. I want to see the language. Lynn will send you the full document tonight, every page. She nodded. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the marble and thought about mopping it. She had mopped it 3 times. The 4th time she'd picked up the mop, she hadn't been mopping. She'd been doing something else entirely, using the motion of it as the scaffolding that held her together while the room decided what it was going to do. The mop had been the most honest thing in the evening, she thought. It required exactly what it required and gave exactly what it gave. She heard footsteps. Not one set. Multiple. She turned. Ole was crossing the ballroom from the direction of the alcove, and he was moving with a purpose that was different from the controlled efficiency of an attorney wrapping up a settlement. He was moving with urgency. the specific urgency of a man who has just received information that changes the shape of what he understood the situation to be. Behind him was his associate, a young woman who had been silent all evening and who was now carrying a phone with the screen facing outward, displaying something that Imani couldn't read from this distance. And behind the associate, standing in the alcove entrance with the expression of a woman who has just made one more decision in a night full of decisions, was Vanessa. Dante rose from the chair before Ole had covered half the distance. "There's a problem," Ole said. "What problem?" Ole reached them and stopped. He looked at Imani and then at Dante, and then he said, "The original payroll documentation for tonight's event, the physical copies, the authorization sheets that listed 47 workers." "What about them?" Dante said. "They're gone," Ole said. The words sat in the air. "What do you mean gone?" Harriet said. She had appeared from somewhere. She'd been in and out of the room all evening, managing the venue's exposure with the grim focus of someone bailing a boat and refusing to discuss the whole, and her voice was sharp. "The table in the coordination workspace," Ole said, "where they were left. They've been removed." He looked at Imani. "The documents that your client described seen earlier in the evening, the ones she recorded in her notebook." "She recorded the numbers," Dante said. "She recorded observations," Ole said carefully, "in a personal notebook, without independent corroboration from the documents themselves. Lynn has the account records. The account records show payments authorized," Ole said. The payroll sheets were the documentation showing the discrepancy between authorized workers and actual workers. Without the sheets, you have account records that show money moved. You don't have the sheets that show where it was supposed to go versus where it went. The ballroom felt suddenly larger. Not physically. The marble and the chandeliers and the tables with their indifferent flowers were exactly where they had been. But the space in the room had shifted, expanded, in the way it did when something that had been solid revealed itself to be contingent. Imani stood up. "Who had access to the coordination workspace?" she said. "It's been accessible to event staff all evening," Harriet said. Her voice had gone tight. "It's a working space. During an event this size, who was in there in the last 2 hours?" Imani said. "We'd need to pull the corridor footage for that wing." "Then pull it," Imani said. "Now." Harriet was already moving toward the door. Ole said, "I want to be clear that my client had no knowledge of—" "Where is Vanessa?" Dante said. Everyone looked at the alcove entrance. Vanessa was not there. She had been there 30 seconds ago. She had been standing in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had made a decision, and whatever that decision was, it had taken her out of the doorway and into a direction that nobody in the room had been watching because they had been looking at Ole. "Find her," Dante said. His gray-suited people moved with the immediate, fluid efficiency of people who understood this instruction completely and had no questions about it. They went in 3 directions simultaneously: the alcove, the corridor beyond it, the service entrance on the far side of the room. Imani stood in the middle of the empty ballroom with the settlement document on the table behind her and her notebook in her back pocket, and the full weight of what was happening pressing down on the top of her skull. The documents were gone. Her notebook had the numbers she'd recorded, headers, figures, date stamps. But a personal notebook was not a document, it was testimony. And testimony from the woman who had been accused of theft tonight, the woman with the prior conviction, the woman who had spent the entire evening at the center of this, was going to be challenged by Ole before it reached any formal proceeding. And the challenge was going to be effective because it was going to be honest about the limitations of what a notebook entry proved. She thought about who had access to the coordination workspace. She thought about who had known the documents were there, had seen them on the table, had understood their significance. She thought about the gap of 30 seconds when everyone in the room had been looking at Ole and the alcove entrance had been empty. She thought about Vanessa standing in that doorway with the expression of a woman who had made a decision. "It wasn't Vanessa," she said. Dante looked at her. "She was in the doorway the whole time Ole was walking toward us," Imani said. "She didn't have time to go to the workspace and come back. She was here." "Then who else knew where the documents were?" Imani said. "Who else understood what they proved?" The room was very quiet. From the corridor came the sound of one of Dante's people moving fast, and then the sound stopped, and the particular quality of the silence that followed was not the silence of someone who had found nothing. The gray-suited man appeared in the ballroom doorway. Gary, he said. One word. Venue supervisor. The man who had run the worker briefing had managed the sign-in log, had told Imani that the Director Rourke's policies superseded the staffing agreements, had stood in the ballroom earlier with the expression of a man regretting his choices, who had been present at the coordination workspace, who had known where the documents were, who had something to lose if the payroll discrepancy was fully documented. Not Vanessa's fraud exactly, but his own role in facilitating it, in running the sign-in process, in managing the forms, in being the person on the ground who had made the gap between 47 workers and 14 workers possible to execute. Imani closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. "Where is he?" she said. "Service exit on the west side," the gray-suited man said. "He has the documents." Imani was moving before the sentence finished. She crossed the ballroom floor at the kind of pace that was not quite running, but was the thing just below running, the stride of someone who has decided that the distance between where they are and where they need to be is unacceptable. Her shoulder was aching, and her feet had been on marble for 9 hours, and none of that was a reason to stop. Behind her she could hear Dante, and behind him the gray-suited man, and behind all of them the sound of Harriet on her radio requesting someone to secure the West Service exit. The service corridor was cold and bright with the flat institutional lighting that existed in the parts of buildings that guests were never meant to see, and it smelled like the industrial cleaner she had carried in her bucket at the beginning of the night, and her footsteps on the concrete were loud in a way that the marble had never been. The west exit door was a heavy fire door, the kind with the push-bar release, and it was in the process of closing when she reached it. She hit the push-bar with both hands. The door swung out into the cold Chicago night, and Gary was there, 5 feet from the door, and he had a manila folder under his arm, and he had been moving toward the parking structure, and he had stopped because the door had opened faster than he'd expected, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been caught doing exactly what he was doing and has not yet decided whether to run or explain. I was 50, maybe 55. Heavier than he'd appeared inside under the flat service corridor lights. His face was flushed, and he was breathing in the specific way of a person who has been moving faster than their body wanted to and is now dealing with the consequences. The folder was under his left arm. She could see the edge of the authorization sheets inside it. "Give me the folder," she said. You don't understand. Give me the folder." "I needed this job," he said. "She's been paying me. For 3 years, she's been paying me to run the sign-in the way she needed it run. And if those sheets disappear, then it's her word against mine. And she's got an attorney, and I've got—" He stopped. He looked at her face. "I've got nothing." "Give me the folder, Gary." He looked at her. He looked at the folder. He looked past her at the door, where Dante and the gray-suited man had arrived, and whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes concluded its processing and came out on the side of the only result that was actually available to him. He held out the folder. She took it. Her hands were very steady. She noted this the way she noted things, quietly, factually, because it was information about the state of herself that she needed to know. Her hands were steady, and her shoulder was screaming, and she was so tired she could feel it in the backs of her eyes, and she was holding the documents that changed the shape of everything that came next. She turned and walked back through the fire door into the service corridor, and the door swung shut behind her with the sound of something closing that had been open too long. Dante was looking at her. She held out the folder. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it, and then at her, and then at the folder again, and something in his expression had gone to a place she couldn't quite map. Not surprised exactly, because she suspected he had stopped being surprised by her approximately 3 hours ago, but something adjacent to it. Something that had more weight than surprise. "This goes back to Bernard," she said. "Tonight, on record." "Yes," he said. "And Gary talks," she said. "All of it. 3 years. What she paid him. How the sign-in worked. Every event." "Yes." She looked at him. "This is not over." "I know." "The settlement covers tonight," she said. "But the pattern Fatima described, other events, other workers, other sign-in logs, that's a different proceeding. That's bigger than tonight." "I know," he said. "I'm going to be part of that proceeding," she said. "Not as a victim, as a witness, with documentation." She looked at the folder in her hand. "I'll need access to the case files as they develop." "You'll have it." "I'll need it formally," she said, "in writing. Not as a favor. He was quiet for a moment. The service corridor hummed around them with its flat lighting and its industrial smell and the sound of the building breathing. And outside the fire door, Chicago was doing what Chicago did at midnight, indifferent to all of it. In writing, he said, formally. Yes. He looked at her with that expression she still couldn't name, the one that had been appearing on his face at intervals throughout the evening, and that she had been declining to examine too closely because she had enough to manage without also managing whatever it meant. The other thing, he said, the training program, the institution. I said I wasn't ready. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to decide. I'm asking you to let me make one phone call, tonight, before you leave. He paused. There's someone I want you to talk to, not about the program, just to talk. She looked at him for a long time. Who? She said. A woman named Carolyn Marsh, he said. She runs workplace safety certification programs for the hospitality industry. She's been trying to get a temp worker advocacy component funded for 2 years. Nobody's written the check. Imani was very still. She has the infrastructure, Dante said. She has the curriculum. She has the relationships with the staffing agencies. He paused. She doesn't have someone who has spent the last 9 hours on a marble floor documenting what happens when none of it exists. The folder was in Imani's hand. The authorization sheets were inside it. Gary was on the other side of a fire door explaining himself to a gray-suited man. Vanessa's statement was on file, unsealed. Jerome's baby was asleep in an apartment with a father who was going to be able to pay next month's rent. Imani looked at the folder. She looked at the service corridor. She looked at the push bar on the fire door, the same kind of push bar she had hit with both hands 90 seconds ago without stopping to think about whether she had the energy for it. Make the call, she said. Dante reached for his phone. And somewhere in the building above them, in the marble ballroom where the chandeliers were still burning and the flowers were still perfect, and the settlement document was on the table with 2 signatures on it, the evening that had begun with an overturned cleaning bucket and a woman who refused to kneel was... The phone call lasted 11 minutes. Imani stood in the service corridor and listened to Dante talk to Carolyn Marsh, and she did not try to hear both sides of the conversation. She heard only his half, which was enough. He was precise and economical in the way she had come to understand was his natural register, not coldness but efficiency, the language of a man who had learned that clarity was a form of respect. He explained what had happened tonight without embellishing it. He said a woman's name once and did not explain who she was or why she mattered, which Imani understood was intentional. When he lowered the phone and held it out to her, she looked at it for a moment before taking it. Ms. Brooks. The voice on the other end was a woman in her 60s, Imani guessed. Not from any weakness in it, but from the particular quality of someone who has been in enough rooms to have stopped performing for them, direct without being hard. I've been trying to get someone to write this curriculum for 2 years. I have the framework, I have the agency relationships, I have the venue partnerships. I don't have the person who's lived inside the problem. I'm not a curriculum writer, Imani said. I'm not asking you to write curriculum, Carolyn said. I'm asking you to come talk to me, in a week or a month or whenever you're ready, and then we'll figure out what you are. Imani was quiet for a moment. The program, she said. If it exists, the workers who go through it, they get certified? Formally, transferable across employers, something no one can take from them when they move to the next job. And the staffing agencies? We're working on making completion a preferred qualification for high-end event placements, Carolyn said. It's slow. These things are slow, but the direction is right. Imani looked at the push bar on the fire door, at the flat industrial light above it, at the folder in her hand with the authorization sheets inside. In a month, she said. In a month, Carolyn said. Or 2, whenever. I'll call you, Imani said. Through my own number, not through him. A pause, then, I'd prefer it that way. Imani handed the phone back to Dante. He took it without comment, which was the right response. Gary gave his statement to Bernard at 12:41 in the morning in the presence of Harriet, Lynn, and Ole, who had, by this point in the evening, moved from adversarial to something more like exhausted witness, present, because his professional obligations required it, and apparently no longer interested in engineering outcomes. Gary talked for 40 minutes, 3 years, 17 events. The arrangement had begun simply. Vanessa had offered him a flat fee per event to run sign-in the way she needed it run. which meant accepting whatever worker count she gave him on the authorization sheets without cross-referencing the actual arrivals. He hadn't asked what happened to the difference. He told himself he hadn't asked because he didn't need to know. "You knew," Imani said. She was sitting at the end of the table. She hadn't been asked to be there, but she was there, and no one had told her to leave. Gary looked at her. Yeah, he said. "I knew." "And the forms," she said. "The acknowledgement forms you handed the workers at the start of the shift." "She prepared them," he said. I handed them out." "You told Jerome it was just an acknowledgement of the briefing." Gary looked at the table. "Yeah." "He's 24 years old," Imani said. "He has an 8-day-old baby. He signed something he didn't understand because you told him it was routine." "I know," Gary said. "I want that in the statement," Imani said to Bernard. "Specifically, the misrepresentation of the forms. What he told the workers they were signing." Bernard typed. Gary did not object. When it was done, Gary sat with his hands flat on the table like a man who has set down something very heavy and is not sure what to do with his hands now that they're empty. He looked older than he had at the start of the evening. Not dramatically. He was the same person in the same body. But the specific aging that happens when someone stops maintaining a particular fiction about themselves. "What happens to me?" he said. "That depends on a lot of things that aren't decided tonight," Harriet said. "Your supervisory position is terminated effective immediately," Harriet said. "That's within my authority, and I'm exercising it." She paused. "What comes after that is for other people to determine." Gary nodded. It was a very small nod, the nod of someone who had expected worse and was not sure yet whether the thing he'd received was better or simply differently shaped. He stood up. He looked at Imani one more time. "She told me you'd been convicted before," he said. "When she asked me to, she said it was insurance, that if things went wrong, your record would—" He stopped. "I should have told her to find someone else." "Yes," Imani said. "You should have." He left. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quiet of a space that has been occupied by something significant for a long time and is now sitting with its absence. "The prior conviction," Lynn said. She was looking at her laptop. She had been looking at her laptop for most of the last hour, with the focused attention of someone following a thread. "I've been pulling the public case files. The freight logistics company. The original complaint." Imani looked at her. "The regional director you reported to," Lynn said, "before you were accused." "Hargrove," Imani said. The name came out of her mouth with the flat ease of something she'd said 10,000 times in her own head. "Marcus Hargrove? He left the company 8 months after your conviction," Lynn said. "Took a position with a different logistics firm in Cincinnati. That firm was audited 3 years later for payroll fraud." She paused. "The audit was triggered by an internal complaint from an accounts receivable clerk." The room was very still. "The clerk withdrew the complaint 6 weeks after filing it," Lynn said. "No public explanation." Imani thought about what it meant to withdraw a complaint. She thought about the version of herself that had not withdrawn hers. She thought about what that decision had cost, and what it had eventually, slowly, years later, meant. "The supervisor," Imani said. "Below Hargrove, the one who first failed to act on my report." "Dina Carver," Lynn said. "She was the one convicted in the separate case 4 years after yours." "Yes." "Her conviction is on record," Lynn said. "The pattern it establishes, combined with tonight's documentation and Gary's statement about Vanessa using your prior record as deliberate leverage, creates a basis for a petition." She looked up from the laptop. "Not a guaranteed outcome. Petitions for expungement based on circumstantial pattern evidence are difficult. But the documentation tonight is stronger than anything in the original case file." Imani was quiet. "What does that mean in practice?" she said. "Realistically." "In practice," Lynn said, "it means someone files the petition, it goes into a queue, it gets reviewed, and then it either gets traction or it doesn't. The timeline is anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. She paused. "And it costs money, attorney fees, filing costs." "I'll cover the costs," Dante said. "No," Imani said. He looked at her. "I'll apply for legal aid," she said. "If I don't qualify, I'll save for it. It's my petition. It goes through my process." She looked at Lynn. "Can you send me the documentation you've pulled?" Everything you have on the original case. I'll take it from there. Lynn looked at her steadily. Tonight? Tonight, Imani said. Before I leave. Lynn sent it in 12 minutes. She was thorough. Imani could see from the file names when they arrived on her phone that it was more comprehensive than she'd expected, the kind of document assembly that usually took days. She did not comment on this. She put her phone in her pocket and stood up from the table. It was 1:15 in the morning. The ballroom looked different, empty. She stood in the entrance and looked at the marble and the chandeliers and the flowers that were still, impossibly, perfect. And she thought about the first time she had stood in this room at the start of the shift, before any of it, when it had existed in the particular potential of a space waiting for an event to fill it. She had mopped this floor. She was aware, in a way she hadn't been aware of during the mopping, of what a strange and specific thing it was to have cleaned a floor that would then host the worst and best and most consequential hours she'd experienced in years. The floor didn't know any of it. The marble didn't care. It had been cleaned, and it had been walked on, and it would be cleaned again tomorrow by someone else who needed the paycheck and would do the figure-8 pattern, or wouldn't, and would go home, and the floor would be the same floor. She was not the same person. She wasn't sure yet what she was instead. Jerome found her there. He had his jacket on and his phone in his hand, and his face had the layered look of someone who had been through something that wouldn't finish processing for weeks, who was just now beginning to understand how long the processing was going to take. "I'm heading out," he said. "Go," she said. "How far is the drive?" 20 minutes, he paused. "My wife doesn't know what happened tonight. She thinks I just worked the shift." "You can tell her or not," Imani said. "That's yours." "I'm going to tell her." He looked at the ballroom. "Not all of it tonight. She needs to sleep. But I'm going to tell her." He looked back at Imani. "Is that... I don't know why I'm telling you this." "It's okay," she said. "Thank you," he said. "For... I don't know exactly what for. All of it. You did the work," she said. "You talked. You stayed. You stayed first." She looked at him. "Go home to your daughter, Jerome." He nodded. He started toward the exit and then stopped and turned back. "Her name is Maya," he said. "My daughter." Imani looked at him. I wanted someone else to know her name tonight," he said. He looked slightly embarrassed by this, the embarrassment of a young man who had said something honest and wasn't sure if it was the right room for it. "Maya," Imani said. He smiled. It was a real smile, the first uncomplicated expression she'd seen on his face all evening. Then he left. She stood in the entrance of the ballroom for another moment. She thought about names, about the things we say to mark that something happened, that it mattered, that it left a trace on us we want someone else to hold. She picked up her mop from where she'd left it against the wall. She looked at it. She thought about putting it back in the supply room and then thought about the state of the south corner of the ballroom, which had been trafficked heavily in the last hour and had not been attended to since her second pass. She started mopping. Dante found her there 20 minutes later. He stood in the entrance and watched her for a moment without speaking, which she was aware of and did not acknowledge. She finished the corner she was working on and moved to the adjacent section, and he came and stood near the edge of her work area and waited. "You should go," she said. "The car's outside." "Then go get in it." "In a minute." He put his hands in his pockets. "Priya." She looked up from the mop. "She cooperated fully," he said. "Her statement is on record. She doesn't have a position to return to. Vanessa's company is effectively dissolved, but she has no charges against her." He paused. "She's 26. She needed the job and she made a bad decision for the same reason most people make bad decisions." "I know," Imani said. "She asked me to tell you she was sorry." "She said it herself," Imani said. "In the room. That counted." "She wanted to say it again." Imani moved the mop. "Tell her I heard it." He was quiet for a moment. "The wedding," he said. "My cousin and her husband. The day is obviously not what anyone planned." "No." "They asked me to tell you that what happened tonight was not your fault." He paused. "And that they're glad you were here." Imani stopped moving the mop. She stood with her hands on the handle and her shoulder aching and the flat marble stretching out in front of her, and she felt something move through her that she had not been expecting and was not entirely prepared for. Not tears. She wasn't going to cry in an empty ballroom at 1 in the morning, but something adjacent to it, Something that came from the same place, the specific pressure of a kindness received when you have been spending all your energy trying not to need one. Thank them, she said. Her voice was steady. She went back to mopping. Dante watched her for another moment. Then he sat down on the floor. Not in a chair. There were chairs. There were 100 chairs arranged at tables around the edges of the room. But on the floor, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him on the marble she'd mopped 3 hours ago, in his black suit that cost more than her car, because apparently that was a thing he was going to do. She looked at him. "What are you doing?" she said. "Sitting." "On the floor?" "Yes." She looked at him for another moment and then went back to mopping, because the floor wasn't going to finish itself and she'd started it. They stayed like that for a while. Her working. Him sitting. The chandeliers burning above them both. The flowers doing what flowers did, which was nothing, which was everything, which was simply being present in a room that had asked a lot of people tonight and was now asking nothing of anyone. 12 years ago, she said. She didn't stop mopping. "Yes," he said. "You were in bad shape." "Yes." "Your men were—" She paused. "They didn't what to do." "No." "I'd done a first aid course 2 years before," she said. "It was required for a warehouse job I had. The job only lasted 4 months, but I kept the manual." She paused. "I almost didn't stop. When I found you, I almost kept walking because there were armed men in the corridor and I had no idea what was happening. Why didn't you?" She thought about it. It was a question she had asked herself, not often, but at certain moments. Moments like the start of that evening, when she had walked through the service entrance and needed one thing, which was her paycheck, and had found instead a water leak and payroll sheets and a woman watching her from across a ballroom with something calculated in her eyes. "Because you were bleeding," she said, "and your people were about to move you wrong and injure you further, and I knew how to do it right." She moved the mop. "It wasn't complicated. I just knew a thing that needed to be known in that moment." "That's complicated," he said. "It's not." "Most people kept walking," he said. She thought about that. She thought about the people who had walked past her on various occasions in her life. Not with malice, not most of them, but with the particular efficiency of people who have correctly calculated that stopping will cost them something they're not sure they can afford. She understood it. She had almost done it herself. "I know," she said. "What happened after?" he said. "The warehouse. You gave evidence." "Yes." "And lost your job." "The company that owned the warehouse was connected to the company I worked for," she said. 2 degrees of separation. Enough." She paused. "I knew it was a risk. And you did it anyway." "The conditions in that building were—" She stopped. "People worked there. People who didn't have the option to not work there. Someone needed to say what the conditions were." He was quiet. "I was 20 years old," she said. "I thought that was enough. Saying the truth into the right room. I thought it would be enough. It wasn't." Not immediately. She finished the section and moved to the next one. "But the building was eventually shut down, not because of my testimony specifically. But the testimony was part of the record that led to the inspections. And the inspections found what they found." She paused. "I wasn't there to see it. I was trying to find another job. But it happened." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. "I built an empire," he said, "on a foundation that includes things I'm not going to describe to you in this room." "I know what you are," she said. "I know you do." He paused. "I've made certain decisions about how certain things operate in my organization. After the warehouse. After what I understood about what you had done and what it had cost you." He stopped. "That probably sounds like I'm trying to make myself into something better than I am." "You're not better than you are," she said. "You're what you are. That's separate from whether some of what you do causes less harm than it used to." He looked at her. "I'm not going to tell you that you're a good man," she said. "I don't know that, but I don't think you're the worst version of what you could have become. And tonight you let the evidence be evidence instead of making it into whatever you needed it to be." She moved the mop. "That mattered." "You stopped me from going after Vanessa," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because destroying her wouldn't have given me anything I actually needed," she said. and it would have given you something that would have made you into a different version of tonight's story. The one where the mafia boss decided justice meant whatever he decided it meant. And this version? This version is messier, she said. The settlement covers tonight and doesn't cover everything. The petition may not go anywhere. Gary loses his job and may or may not face further consequences. Vanessa's company is gone, but Vanessa still exists, and Vanessa is still Vanessa, and in 5 years she may rebuild something, and there may be more Garys and more Priyas in her orbit. She paused. That's the version we have. It's not clean. No, he said. But the documents are on file. Fatima's complaint is on record. The workers have their wages, and Carolyn Marsh has a phone number she didn't have yesterday. She looked at him. That's what happened tonight. Not justice with a capital letter. Just a few things moved that needed to move. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You should not be mopping this floor. The south corner needed doing. Imani. The floor needed mopping, she said. I mopped it. That's what happened. Don't make it into a symbol. He looked at her. And that expression, the one she'd been declining to examine all evening, the one that appeared at intervals and had more in it than she knew what to do with, was there again, and this time she didn't look away from it. She let herself look at it directly, the way she'd been looking at things directly all evening, because looking away from things had cost her too much in her life to be worth the comfort of it. What she saw was not what she'd expected. It was not admiration, exactly. It was something older than admiration and less comfortable. The expression of someone who has encountered a person who makes the version of themselves they've been presenting to the world feel thin and temporary. Not in a way that diminished him, in a way that cost him something, and he was paying it, and he knew he was paying it. She looked away, not because she was afraid of it, because it was 1 a.m. and she was 32 years old, and she had been on her feet for 10 hours, and there was a limit to how much she could hold simultaneously. I'm going to finish this section, she said, and then I'm going to put the mop away and collect my things and take the train home. I can have a car. I'll take the train, she said. He nodded. He got up from the floor. The movement was smooth despite how long he'd been sitting, and he brushed the back of his suit jacket with one hand and looked at the marble and then at her. A month, he said, or 2. For the call to Carolyn. Yes. I said I'd make it, she said. I'll make it. I know. He paused. I just wanted to say it again. She looked at him. Go home, Dante. Something crossed his face that was almost, not quite, a smile. Then he turned and crossed the ballroom, and his footsteps on the marble were quiet and even, and the doors opened and then closed, and he was gone. She finished mopping at 1:47. She put the mop in the supply room and the bucket beside it and the gloves, the ones with the tear in the right index finger that she had turned inside out at the start of the shift, on the shelf above the cleaning solutions. She removed her apron. She held it for a moment. The broken strap, the safety pin still half done, the front pocket where the sapphire had been placed and found and held up in the chandelier light for 300 people to see. She folded it and set it on the shelf. She picked up her work shoes from the plastic bag she'd carried them in since the service entrance. She sat on the supply room floor and put them on, one at a time, the left one with the sole that was starting to separate, and she laced them carefully because the lacing was the last line of defense on a failing sole. She stood up. She got her jacket from locker 14. She got her original notebook, the small one, the one she'd been writing in since before the event began, and she held it for a moment. It was dense with handwriting now, 9 hours of observations, times and names and details that had turned out to matter more than she'd known when she was writing them. She put it in her jacket pocket. She walked to the service entrance and pushed the door and stepped out into the Chicago night. It was cold. Not brutally cold, the deep January cold that settled into the bones, but the sharp, clarifying cold of a fall night that had decided to mean it. The city was doing its late-night thing around her. The distant sound of traffic on Michigan Avenue, the orange wash of the streetlights, a siren somewhere southeast that grew and then faded. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in. Her shoulder hurt. Her feet hurt. She was hungry. She'd been promised a meal at 8 o'clock and had received nothing, and the granola bar that Jerome had given her from his own portion at 10 was a long time ago now. She thought about what she was going to eat when she got home. She had rice and 2 eggs and half a container of leftover beans that were probably still good. She was going to make something with that and eat it, and then she was going to sleep, and in the morning she was going to wake up in the same apartment she'd woken up in this morning, with the same bills and the same broken kitchen drawer that she kept meaning to fix, and the same view of the alley from the east window. And the documents Lynn had sent would be on her phone, and Carolyn Marsh would have her number, and Maya Jerome would be 8 days old and asleep in her father's apartment. She started walking toward the train. 3 months later, Imani Brooks sat in a conference room on the 7th floor of a building in the West Loop, across a table from Carolyn Marsh, who was exactly what her voice had suggested. Direct, no performance, old enough to have stopped being impressed by the things that were designed to impress. And they talked for 4 hours. Not about the program specifically, about what the program would need to be. About forms and what happened when people signed them under pressure. About water leaks and electrical panels, and the specific calculation a temporary worker made when deciding whether to report a hazard in a venue where their continued employment depended on the goodwill of a director who had already demonstrated she didn't value their opinion. About certification and what it meant to carry a credential that transferred across employers, that belonged to the person and not the job. Carolyn listened the way people listened when they were actually listening, which was differently from the way people listened when they were waiting to speak. At the end of the 4 hours, she said, "When can you start?" Imani said, "I need to give 2 weeks' notice at my current position." Carolyn said, "2 weeks is fine." The petition for expungement was filed 11 months after the night at the Harrington Grand. The attorney was a woman named Sue Jin Park, who worked for a legal aid organization on the North Side, and who, when Imani came to her with Lynn's documentation and the case files and the record of what had happened at the Harrington, had sat with the materials for a long time before saying, "This is a strong pattern, not guaranteed, but strong." "I know," Imani said. "It'll take time," Sujin said. "I know," Imani said. "I have time." The petition went into the queue. It was reviewed. It moved, slowly, the way things move through systems that were not designed for speed, and Imani watched it move the way she watched things she needed to know about without being able to control, noting the information, filing it, continuing to do the work in front of her that didn't require the outcome to be known. The first cohort of the Worker Safety Certification Program graduated on a Tuesday in March. 14 people. Cleaners, servers, drivers, parking attendants. They had come through 8 weeks of training, not just safety procedures, not just form literacy, not just documentation practices, but the full architecture of knowing your own rights clearly enough to act on them in a corridor at 11 o'clock at night, when a supervisor with a clipboard was telling you something that wasn't true. Imani had taught 6 of the 8 sessions herself. The graduation was not a ceremony. It was a room with folding chairs and coffee from a drip machine that wasn't quite hot enough, and the certificates printed on paper that was slightly nicer than standard. And Carolyn gave a short speech that was mostly practical and only briefly emotional, which was the right proportion. Afterward, one of the graduates, a woman named Sandra, mid-40s, who had been cleaning hotel rooms for 16 years and had never heard of a signed acknowledgement form being anything other than what she was told it was, came to Imani and said, "My daughter works events. I'm going to have her take the next cohort." Imani said, "The registration opens next month." Sandra said, "I know, I already told her." The expungement was granted 14 months after the petition was filed. Sujin called her on a Wednesday morning when Imani was between meetings, standing in the hallway outside the program office, with a cup of coffee that was also not quite hot enough. She heard the words and she stood very still in the hallway, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been carrying for 7 years. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. The way you carry a stone that you've stopped noticing is heavy until it's not there anymore. Shift and settle and become something else. She thanked Sujin. She asked about the paperwork. She confirmed the timeline for the official record update. Then she stood in the hallway for another minute after the call ended. She thought about the accounts receivable job, about Marcus Hargrove, about the courtroom and the attorney who had told her to be patient and trust the process, and had not, in the end, been wrong exactly, but had been wrong about the timeline and wrong about what patience would cost. She thought about the service entrance of the Harrington Grand, about locker 14 and the safety pin and the figure-8 pattern on the marble and the moment the music died. She thought about a 20-year-old woman in a burning warehouse who almost kept walking. She thought about what it meant that she hadn't. She finished her coffee. She went back into the meeting. 6 months after that, there was a safety event at the Harrington Grand. Not a wedding, a venue industry conference, the kind that happened every year without most people noticing it. Hotel managers and event directors and logistics coordinators, the people who ran the rooms that other people celebrated in. The certification program had a table in the vendor hall. Imani was not at the table. She was doing a walkthrough of the venue's service areas because part of the program's new relationship with the Harrington included a quarterly safety assessment, and the assessments were thorough, and thoroughness required walking the corridors. She walked through the east wing. She checked the electrical panel, properly fitted now, the pipe repaired, the seams sealed. She noted the status on her clipboard. Hazard corrected. No incident. She was coming back through the main corridor toward the ballroom entrance when she heard footsteps and looked up. Dante Moretti was crossing the lobby in the direction of the vendor hall with the same gray-suited man who had been at the Harrington that night and who was apparently a permanent feature of his landscape. He was wearing a different suit, charcoal today, not black, and he was looking at his phone, which he put in his pocket when he saw her. They stopped. The lobby was busy. Conference attendees, venue staff, the general motion of an active building on an event day. Assessment day, he said. Quarterly, she said. How's it looking? Better than it was, she said. The east panel's been properly remediated. The supply room restocking protocol is improved. The sign-in procedure? She paused. It'll take a few more quarters before I'm satisfied with the sign-in procedure. He nodded. Carolyn told me the second cohort enrolled at capacity. 17 people, she said. We have a wait list for the third. That's... Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The petition. Granted, she said, 4 months ago. Something moved across his face. Not surprised. She'd told him it was in process, and he had the resources to know the outcome before she told him, though she was fairly certain he hadn't used them. Good, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at her. The lobby moved around them, the conference attendees and the venue staff, and the ordinary busy motion of a building that had no memory of what had happened in it on a particular October night 14 months ago. She looked back at him. She thought about the things that connected them. The warehouse, the ballroom, the service corridor with the fire door, a phone call made at 1 a.m. between a man who had resources and a woman who had a notebook, and they had turned out to matter about equally. She thought about the things that separated them, which were real and significant and would remain real and significant, and which she had no interest in pretending were otherwise. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone, fully, including the parts you hadn't shown them. The 7-year conviction, the almost walking away, the notebook that had started as instinct and ended as evidence, and to be seen without it being turned into a claim on you. There's a cleaner who just started in the west corridor, she said. New hire. She mopped with straight lines and left streaks on the marble. He looked at her. I'm going to go show her the figure 8 pattern, she said. A pause. Okay, he said. It makes a difference, she said, right? On marble. The pattern matters. I know, he said. She looked at him for one more moment, the man who had stood up in a ballroom when 300 people were filming her and had helped her stand, and had then understood that standing was something she needed to do herself. And she nodded, once, and turned and walked down the corridor toward the west wing. Behind her, she heard him continue toward the vendor hall. The marble was clean under her feet. She had not mopped it today. Someone else had, with straight lines, and the streaks caught the lobby light in thin parallel bands that would bother her until they were fixed. She walked past them and thought about the woman in the west corridor and what it took to learn something new when you were already tired, when you needed the job and hadn't been told that the technique mattered, when nobody had ever stopped and said, "Here, let me show you the way that actually works." She pushed open the corridor door. Excuse me, she said. I'm Imani Brooks from the Worker Safety Program. Can I show you something about the floor pattern? It'll take 2 minutes. The woman looked up from her mop. She was maybe 45, wearing the same kind of apron Imani had worn 14 months ago, the temporary worker number stamped on the front pocket. Sure, she said. Imani took